Hello there, and welcome back. Maybe you've had a long day, maybe your mind is still racing with thoughts that won't settle, or maybe you just prefer drifting off while journeying through time rather than staring at the ceiling. Whatever brought you here tonight, you're in the right place. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your shoulders drop, feel the weight leaving your body, and allow your breathing to find its own gentle rhythm. Tonight, we travel back more than 5,000 years, to a mountain pass in the Alps where a man took his final steps, where ice and time preserved a story that would wait millennia to be told. A story about Ötzi, the Iceman, the most well-preserved natural mummy ever discovered, a window into an ancient world that existed long before writing, before cities, before empires. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a thought in the comments. It helps others find their way here too, one curious mind at a time. But for now, if you're comfortable, let's begin our descent into the deep past, to a September day in 1991 when two hikers stumbled upon a mystery frozen in time. The Alps rise along the border between Austria and Italy, ancient mountains worn smooth by countless millennia of wind, water, and ice. These peaks have witnessed the passage of countless travelers, traders, hunters, and wanderers, their stories usually lost to time, scattered with the seasons. But sometimes, rarely, the mountains keep their secrets locked away in ice, preserving what would otherwise crumble into dust. September 19, 1991, started as an ordinary hiking day for Helmut and Erika Simon, a German couple enjoying the late summer weather in the Ötztal Alps. The snow had retreated more than usual that year, exposing terrain that hadn't seen sunlight in thousands of years. They were walking at an altitude of 3,210 meters, roughly 10,530 feet above sea level, along a mountain pass between the Hauslabjoch and the Tissenjoch. The air was thin and cold, but the views were spectacular, stretching across valleys and peaks that seemed to touch the edges of the sky. They noticed something dark protruding from the ice and snow near the walking path. At first glance, it appeared to be debris, perhaps trash left by careless hikers, or maybe the remains of an unfortunate mountaineer who had perished in the harsh conditions. The Alps had claimed many lives over the years, and discoveries of bodies were not entirely uncommon, though they were always sobering reminders of the mountain's power. But as they approached, something seemed different about this particular find. The object was brown and leathery, partially embedded in ice and meltwater. They could make out what appeared to be a human back and shoulders, skin darkened and preserved in a way that suggested great age. The body was lying face down in a rocky gully, positioned as if the person had simply laid down to rest and never risen again. The Simons didn't disturb the body. Instead, they took a photograph and reported their discovery to the authorities once they returned to civilization. They assumed, reasonably, that they had found the remains of a modern mountaineer, perhaps someone who had disappeared in recent decades. The Alps held many such stories, climbers and hikers who had set out on journeys and never returned, their fates unknown until the glacier eventually revealed what they had hidden. The initial response was measured. Austrian authorities were notified, and the assumption remained that this was a relatively recent victim of the mountain's unforgiving nature. A recovery operation was organized, but there was no particular urgency beyond the practicality of retrieving the body before the next snowfall buried it again for another season or century. On September 23, 4 days after the initial discovery, a team arrived to extract the body. The operation was complicated by the body's position, frozen partially into the ice within a natural gully. The recovery team used ice axes and even a small jackhammer to chip away at the surrounding ice, not yet realizing the archaeological significance of what they were handling. This rough treatment would later be a source of regret among scientists, as some damage was done to the body and surrounding artifacts during the extraction. As they worked to free the body, more unusual items began to appear. There was a copper axe blade visible near the mummy, an item that seemed oddly archaic. Fragments of clothing, pieces of equipment, and other organic materials emerged from the ice. The copper axe, in particular, caught attention. Its presence was puzzling because copper tools had long since been replaced by iron and steel in the Alps. The body was eventually freed from its icy tomb and placed in a coffin for transport. During this process, the recovery team and observers began to realize that this might not be a recent death after all. The clothing, the tools, the overall appearance of the preservation, all suggested something far older than anyone had initially assumed. The copper axe was particularly telling. Copper had been used in Europe during the Bronze Age and earlier, thousands of years before modern times. The remains were taken to the Institute of Forensic Medicine at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. This is where the true nature of the discovery began to reveal itself. Forensic pathologist Rainer Henn examined the body and quickly determined that this was no modern mountaineer. The level of preservation, the style of the artifacts, and the physical characteristics of the remains all pointed to extraordinary antiquity. Initial estimates, based on the visible artifacts and the condition of the body, suggested that the remains could be several hundred to possibly several thousand years old. This was exciting enough, as well-preserved ancient human remains were rare and valuable for understanding the past. But the full truth was even more remarkable than these early guesses. The question of exactly how old the Iceman was required scientific dating methods. Archaeologist Konrad Spindler from the University of Innsbruck examined the copper axe and other artifacts. Based on the style and construction of the items, particularly the axe, he made a bold preliminary assessment. He suggested that the body could date back to around 4,000 years ago, to the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age. This would make the find extraordinarily significant, a time capsule from an era of European history that was poorly understood. But even this estimate, as dramatic as it was, would prove to be conservative. The true age of Ötzi would be revealed through radiocarbon dating, a scientific technique that measures the decay of carbon-14 isotopes in organic material. This method can provide remarkably accurate dates for organic remains up to about 50,000 years old. Samples of tissue and organic material from the body and the surrounding artifacts were sent to laboratories for radiocarbon dating. The scientific community waited with anticipation for the results, knowing that whatever the date turned out to be, this discovery was already proving to be extraordinary. When the results came back, they stunned everyone involved. The radiocarbon dates placed Ötzi's death at approximately 3,300 BCE, give or take a few decades. This meant the body was not 4,000 years old, but more than 5,000 years old. The Iceman had died during the late Neolithic period, also known as the Copper Age, a transitional time when humans were beginning to work with metal but still relied heavily on stone tools. To put this date in perspective, Ötzi lived and died more than 5,300 years before the present day. He walked the Alps centuries before the construction of Stonehenge was completed, over 600 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was built, and more than a millennium before the rise of the ancient Greek civilization. He belonged to a Europe of scattered farming communities, where villages were small, writing had not yet been invented, and the landscape was still heavily forested. The Copper Age, spanning roughly from 4,500 BCE to 3,300 BCE in the Alpine region, was a period of significant technological and social change. Humans had mastered agriculture thousands of years earlier during the Neolithic Revolution, learning to cultivate crops and domesticate animals. This shift from hunting and gathering to farming had allowed populations to grow and settle in permanent communities. By Ötzi's time, these communities had developed sophisticated skills in various crafts. They could produce pottery, weave textiles, build substantial wooden structures, and work with copper, one of the first metals that humans learned to manipulate. Copper could be hammered into shape when cold and melted and cast when heated, making it valuable for creating tools, weapons, and ornaments. However, copper is relatively soft compared to later metals like bronze and iron. tools made from copper would wear down more quickly than their stone counterparts in many applications. This meant that the Copper Age was truly a transitional period, where both metal and stone tools coexisted, each used for different purposes based on their specific properties. The landscape of Europe during Ötzi's lifetime was different from what we see today. The climate was in a period known as the Atlantic Optimum, a phase of the Holocene epoch when temperatures were slightly warmer than modern pre-industrial averages. This warmth meant that tree lines extended higher up mountains, and glaciers were smaller than they would become in later, cooler periods. The Alps themselves were less glaciated than they had been during the Ice Age, but still formidable. Passes through the mountains were crucial for travel and trade between the Italian peninsula to the south and the regions to the north. These routes were likely used seasonally, when weather conditions made them passable, connecting different communities and allowing the exchange of goods, ideas, and perhaps genetic material through intermarriage. Archaeological evidence from the Copper Age shows that people lived in small villages, often built near water sources and arable land. Houses were typically constructed from wood, wattle and daub, with thatched roofs. Communities would have been largely self-sufficient, growing crops like emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and barley, while raising domesticated animals including sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. But life was not isolated. There is clear evidence of long-distance trade networks operating across Europe during this period. High-quality flint from specific sources was distributed over hundreds of kilometers. Copper and other metals were traded from regions where they could be mined to areas where they were scarce. Shells from the Mediterranean and other exotic materials found their way far inland, suggesting that people traveled, that goods moved along established routes, and that communities were connected in ways that belied their small size and apparent simplicity. Ötzi himself would prove to be evidence of these connections. The items he carried, the materials his equipment was made from, and even the food in his stomach would all tell stories of movement, trade, and a life that was far more complex and interconnected than one might initially assume for someone living more than 5 millennia ago. The revelation of Ötzi's true age transformed the discovery from an interesting historical find into one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Here was not just an ancient body, but the most well-preserved human remains from the Copper Age ever found. Unlike the skeletal remains typically recovered from this period, Ötzi still had skin, internal organs, brain tissue, and even eyeballs, all preserved by the unique conditions of his alpine burial. The preservation was due to a fortunate combination of circumstances. After his death, Ötzi's body had been quickly covered by snow and ice, which protected it from scavengers and slowed decomposition. He had died in a small gully, a depression in the rock that shielded his body from the grinding movement of glacier. If he had been just a few meters away, the flowing ice would have crushed and scattered his remains across the mountainside. For over 5,000 years, he lay frozen in this natural time capsule. The ice above him would have waxed and waned with climatic changes, but the particular configuration of the gully and the glacier kept him sealed away, slowly freeze-drying his tissues in a process that turned his body into a natural mummy. By the time the warm conditions of 1991 exposed him, he had been transformed into a leathery, preserved testament to the distant past. The importance of this preservation cannot be overstated. Typically, all that survives from the Copper Age are durable materials like stone, pottery, and occasionally metal. Organic materials such as wood, leather, textiles, and food decay relatively quickly under normal burial conditions. But Ötzi had his clothes, his equipment, even the contents of his stomach, all frozen in time at the moment of his death. This meant that scientists could examine not just his body, but his entire material culture in exquisite detail. They could see exactly how clothing was constructed, how tools were hafted and used, what materials were preferred for different purposes, and how all these items were actually worn and carried. It was like finding a perfectly preserved snapshot of daily life from an era that had previously been known only through scattered fragments and educated guesswork. The scientific study of Ötzi would become one of the most intensive and prolonged investigations of a single individual in the history of archaeology. Teams of specialists from multiple disciplines would examine every aspect of the Iceman, using technologies that ranged from traditional archaeological methods to cutting-edge medical imaging and genetic analysis. But before the science could truly begin, there was a matter of some diplomatic complexity to resolve. The discovery site was in the High Alps, near what was presumed to be the border between Austria and Italy. Initially, it was believed that Ötzi had been found on the Austrian side, which is why Austrian authorities had taken charge of the recovery and why the body was taken to Innsbruck. However, a more precise survey conducted after the discovery revealed that the site was actually 92 meters inside Italian territory. This meant that, technically, Ötzi belonged to Italy, not Austria. After some negotiation, it was agreed that the Iceman would eventually be transferred to Italy, specifically to the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, where he remains to this day. Austria was allowed to keep the body temporarily for initial studies, but the ultimate custody was Italian. This jurisdictional question settled, the scientific community could focus on the remarkable opportunity that Ötzi represented. The body was moved to a specialized facility where it could be kept at a constant temperature just below freezing, with carefully controlled humidity to prevent deterioration. Every examination had to be planned carefully, as each exposure to warmer temperatures risked damaging the delicate, ancient tissues. The researchers approached their subject with a combination of excitement and reverence. They were looking at a real person, someone who had lived, worked, loved, suffered, and died more than 5,000 years ago. Every detail they could learn from his body and possessions was a gift, a message from the deep past speaking directly to the present. And Ötzi had much to tell. His body would reveal information about ancient health and disease, about diet and lifestyle, about the physical demands of life in the Copper Age. His equipment would demonstrate technological sophistication that surprised many scholars. His clothes would show the artistry and practical knowledge of ancient people. And his death, as we would eventually learn, was not peaceful but violent, adding a dark and compelling mystery to his story. The Iceman's body itself tells a rich story. When fully analyzed, scientists determined that Ötzi was approximately 45 years old at the time of his death, though some estimates range from the early 40s to the late 40s. This made him relatively old for the Copper Age, when average life expectancy was considerably lower than modern standards. Many people did not survive past their 30s, succumbing to disease, accidents, violence, or the accumulated effects of a harsh lifestyle. That Ötzi reached his mid-40s suggests he was hardy, skilled, and perhaps fortunate until his final day. His height was estimated at approximately 160 centimeters, or about 5 feet 3 inches. While this might seem short by modern standards, particularly compared to average heights in developed countries today, it was likely typical or perhaps even slightly above average for his time and place. Nutrition in the Neolithic and Copper Age was adequate but not abundant, and childhood diseases or periodic food shortages could affect growth. The general increase in average human height over the past century is largely due to improved nutrition and healthcare, so Ötzi's stature should be understood in the context of his own era. His build was lean and muscular, consistent with a life of physical activity. There was little body fat, suggesting that he lived an active lifestyle with periods where food might have been scarce. His musculature, particularly in his legs, indicated someone accustomed to walking long distances over difficult terrain, which makes sense given where he was found and the mountainous environment of his final journey. The condition of Ötzi's body revealed numerous health issues, some minor and some more significant. His teeth showed considerable wear, with cavities, periodontal disease, and evidence of significant enamel wear. The wear patterns suggest a diet that included coarse, gritty foods, perhaps grain products ground with stones that left small mineral particles in the flour. This was common in ancient times before refined milling techniques. He was missing one of his upper teeth, lost well before his death as the bone had remodeled where the tooth had been. Other teeth showed signs of decay and wear, conditions that would have caused discomfort or pain, though they were likely considered normal for someone of his age. X-rays and CT scans revealed that Ötzi suffered from arthritis in several joints, particularly in his neck, lower back, and hips. These degenerative conditions were likely the result of years of physical labor and perhaps the effects of aging. The arthritis in his spine would have caused stiffness and pain, especially in cold weather or after periods of inactivity. For someone living an active, outdoor life in a mountainous region, this chronic pain would have been a constant companion. Interestingly, some of Ötzi's tattoos, which we will discuss in greater detail later, were located precisely over areas affected by arthritis and degenerative joint disease. This has led researchers to speculate that the tattoos might have been a form of therapeutic treatment, similar to acupuncture, intended to relieve pain. Whether this was effective or not, it shows that people in the Copper Age had developed systematic approaches to managing chronic pain and illness. Further examination revealed evidence of parasitic infections. Ötzi harbored whipworm eggs in his intestines, indicating an active infection with Trichuris trichiura, a parasitic worm that infects humans through contaminated food or water. Whipworm infections were common in ancient times and remain a problem in some parts of the world today. While usually not fatal, they can cause abdominal pain, diarrhea, and malnutrition if the infection is heavy. The presence of these parasites tells us something about sanitation and hygiene in Ötzi's community, where human and animal waste likely contaminated water and food sources. There was also evidence that Ötzi had suffered from Lyme disease, a bacterial infection transmitted by ticks. DNA analysis revealed the presence of Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacterium that causes Lyme disease, in his tissues. This makes Ötzi the earliest known case of this disease in human history. Lyme disease can cause a range of symptoms including joint pain, fatigue, and neurological problems if left untreated. It's possible that some of Ötzi's joint problems were exacerbated by this infection, adding another layer of discomfort to his daily existence. The discovery of Lyme disease in Ötzi was scientifically significant beyond just adding to his medical history. It confirmed that the disease has been present in Europe for at least 5,000 years and that the bacteria-tick-human transmission cycle was established long before modern times. This has implications for understanding the evolution and distribution of infectious diseases. Analysis of Ötzi's DNA revealed even more about his origins and relationships. His genetic profile showed that he belonged to a genetic lineage that is now relatively rare in Europe. His Y chromosome haplogroup was G2A, which today is found at low frequencies across Europe but is more common in some isolated populations, particularly in the Mediterranean region and parts of the Middle East. This suggests that the population structure of Europe has changed considerably over the past 5,000 years, with migrations and population replacements altering the genetic landscape. His mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the maternal line, belonged to haplogroup K1, which is more common in modern European populations. Together, these genetic markers paint a picture of Ötzi's ancestry and help scientists understand the complex population movements and mixtures that occurred during the Neolithic and Bronze Age. The genetic analysis also revealed information about his physical appearance. Ötzi likely had brown eyes, which is still the most common eye color worldwide. His hair color was probably dark brown or black, though the hair found with his body had been affected by the preservation process, making its original color difficult to determine directly. His skin color was likely somewhat darker than that of many modern Northern Europeans, closer to the complexion of people from Southern Europe today. One genetic marker that caught attention was an increased predisposition to cardiovascular disease. Ötzi had genetic variants associated with a higher risk of atherosclerosis, the buildup of fatty deposits in arteries that can lead to heart attacks and strokes. CT scans of his arteries confirmed that he had, indeed, developed calcifications in his blood vessels, showing early signs of atherosclerotic disease. This was somewhat surprising given his lean physique and active lifestyle, suggesting that genetic factors played a significant role in his cardiovascular health. The presence of cardiovascular disease in a person from the Copper Age was enlightening for modern medicine. It demonstrated that atherosclerosis is not solely a disease of modern lifestyles characterized by processed foods, sedentary habits, and stress. Even someone living an active, outdoor life with a diet presumably free of processed foods could develop cardiovascular problems if they had the genetic predisposition. This finding has helped contextualize our understanding of heart disease and its multiple contributing factors. Ötzi's brain was partially preserved, which is extremely rare in ancient remains. The brain tissue had shrunk and changed from its original state, but it was still present, allowing scientists to study aspects of his neurological health. There was no evidence of major brain diseases or injuries beyond the trauma he suffered at his death, which we will discuss later. The preservation of soft tissues allowed for extraordinarily detailed studies that would be impossible with skeletal remains alone. Scientists could examine his muscles, tendons, ligaments, and even some blood vessels. They could study his internal organs, though these had deteriorated more than the skin and muscle. The stomach and intestines were sufficiently preserved to allow for analysis of their contents, providing direct evidence of Ötzi's last meals. One fascinating aspect of the physical examination was the condition of his lungs. Microscopic analysis revealed substantial deposits of soot and carbon particles in the lung tissue. This indicated that Ötzi had spent considerable time around fires, breathing in smoke. In an era before chimneys and efficient ventilation, indoor fires would have filled living spaces with smoke, and anyone spending time in such environments would inhale significant amounts of particulate matter. The soot in Ötzi's lungs is testament to countless hours spent around hearth fires, cooking, staying warm, and perhaps working on various tasks during long winter nights. The detailed physical study of Ötzi established him not as an abstract archaeological specimen, but as a real person with real ailments, real pain, and real life experiences. He was someone who probably woke up stiff on cold mornings, whose joints ached after a long day of walking, who had toothaches, stomach troubles, and all the small and large discomforts that make up human existence. In this way, despite the vast gulf of time separating us, he becomes relatable, a person not so different from ourselves. The equipment Ötzi carried with him into the mountains provides a detailed look at the technology and material culture of the Copper Age. He was remarkably well equipped, carrying tools and clothing that demonstrated both sophistication in design and practical knowledge of materials and their properties. Perhaps the most famous item in Ötzi's possession was his copper axe. This tool immediately caught the attention of researchers because it was the first complete Copper Age axe ever found with its handle intact. The axe head was made of nearly pure copper, weighing about 400 grams, or roughly 0.9 pounds. It had been cast in a mold, a manufacturing technique that required knowledge of metallurgy and the ability to reach temperatures of over 1000 degrees Celsius to melt the copper. The copper itself was not local to the immediate area where Ötzi was found. Trace element analysis revealed that the copper originated from ore sources in what is now southern Tuscany, in Italy, several hundred kilometers from the discovery site. This indicates that either Ötzi had traveled long distances, or more likely, that there were established trade networks through which metal and metal objects moved across considerable distances. The axe might have been quite valuable, representing a significant investment in materials and skilled labor. The axe head was hafted to a handle made from yew wood, carefully shaped to fit the hand and provide good leverage. The attachment method was ingenious. The handle had been carved with a slight crook near the end, and the axe head was secured into a slot cut into this crook. Leather straps and birch tar, a natural adhesive made by heating birch bark, held everything tightly together. The construction was solid and functional, showing that the ancient craftsman understood the stresses the tool would face during use. The copper axe would have been used for multiple purposes, including woodworking, cutting branches, and possibly as a weapon. Copper axes are effective for working green wood, though they dull more quickly than stone axes when used on hard or seasoned wood. The axe was a symbol of status as well as a practical tool, indicating that Ötzi was likely a person of some standing in his community, given the value of metal objects at the time. Ötzi carried a partially finished yew longbow. The bow was approximately 1.8 meters long, or about 6 feet, making it taller than Ötzi himself. Yew wood is prized for bow making because of its unique properties. The sapwood, the lighter outer layers of the tree, is flexible and resists tension well, while the heartwood, the darker inner wood, resists compression. A yew bow that incorporates both sapwood and heartwood in its design becomes a natural composite, combining these properties for optimal performance. However, Ötzi's bow was unfinished. It had been roughly shaped but not yet refined to final form. The string notches at the ends had not been cut, and the bow had not been properly tillered, the process of carefully shaping and balancing a bow so that it bends evenly when drawn. This suggests that Ötzi might have been in the process of making or acquiring a new bow, perhaps because his previous weapon had broken or been lost. He did carry a quiver, a container for arrows, which was made from wild animal hide, probably deer. The quiver was cylindrical, designed to hold arrows and protect them from damage. Inside the quiver were 14 arrow shafts, but only 2 of these were fully functional arrows. The others were blanks, unfinished shafts without points or fletching, perhaps meant to be completed at a later time or kept as spare materials. The 2 finished arrows were works of considerable craftsmanship. The shafts were made from the wood of the wayfaring tree, a type of viburnum. Each arrow had fletching, feathers attached to the shaft to stabilize the arrow in flight. The feathers appear to have come from different bird species, showing that the arrow maker used whatever suitable materials were available. The fletching was attached with birch tar adhesive and bound with fine thread or sinew. Most interestingly, each finished arrow was tipped with a carefully worked flint point. These points were sharp and symmetrically shaped, demonstrating skilled knapping, the technique of shaping stone by precise striking. The flint points were set into notches cut into the arrow shafts and secured with more birch tar and sinew binding. These arrows would have been effective for hunting game, capable of penetrating animal hide and causing lethal injuries. The presence of unfinished arrows and an unfinished bow suggests that Ötzi's equipment was in a state of transition. Perhaps he had recently experienced some mishap that damaged his gear, or perhaps he was in the middle of seasonal preparations. Regardless, he was clearly someone who knew how to make and maintain his own tools, a necessary skill in an age before specialized craftspeople and shops. For carrying his equipment, Ötzi had a backpack frame made from hazel wood. This frame consisted of a long, U-shaped hazel rod that would rest against the back, with larchwood boards to provide a platform for items. The frame was designed to distribute weight across the shoulders and hips, similar in principle to modern backpacking frames. This shows a sophisticated understanding of ergonomics and the physical demands of carrying loads over long distances. Unfortunately, the details of how items were secured to this frame and how it was attached to the body are not entirely clear, as some of the binding materials had degraded. However, the presence of a carefully constructed frame indicates that Ötzi was prepared for extended travel, carrying supplies and equipment that would support him during his journey through the mountains. He also carried 2 containers made from birch bark. Birch bark is an excellent material for making waterproof containers because it can be bent and sewn, and it naturally resists moisture. One of these containers held embers wrapped in maple leaves, preserved with fresh plants. This suggests that Ötzi was carrying a means of starting fires. Keeping embers alive in a portable container would have been much easier than starting a fire from scratch using friction or flint and tinder, especially in cold, damp mountain conditions. The technology of the time made fire starting challenging, so transporting live embers was a practical solution for travelers. Among Ötzi's possessions were various small tools and implements. He had a flint knife with a wooden handle, small enough to be carried easily but sharp and functional for various cutting tasks. The blade was finely knapped, with a sharp edge that could be resharpened as needed. He carried a bone awl, a pointed tool used for punching holes in leather or hide, essential for making or repairing clothing and footwear. There was also a tool that might have been used as a retoucher, a device for carefully working the edges of stone tools to sharpen or reshape them. Particularly interesting was a small pouch containing various items. Inside were a scraper tool, a drill, and a piece of tinder fungus, along with a kind of white, porous material that was likely a type of bracket fungus. Tinder fungus, specifically a species called Fomes fomentarius, was used as a fire-starting material because it catches sparks easily and burns slowly. The white fungus material may have had medicinal properties. Some bracket fungi contain compounds that have antibiotic or anti-inflammatory effects, and there is evidence that ancient peoples used various fungi for medicinal purposes. 2 pieces of this fungus were threaded onto leather straps, suggesting they were deliberately carried for a specific purpose. Some researchers have speculated that Ötzi might have been using this fungus as a form of medicine, possibly to treat infections or stomach ailments. Given his intestinal parasites and other health issues, the idea that he carried medicinal materials is plausible. Ötzi's clothing was equally fascinating, providing unprecedented detail about how people dressed during the Copper Age. His garments were made from various animal hides and plant fibers, carefully constructed to provide protection from the cold mountain environment. He wore a cloak made from woven grass, specifically a type of alpine grass. This cloak was rectangular, draped over the shoulders like a cape, and reached down to about the knees. Grass cloaks have water-shedding properties, helping to keep the wearer dry in rain or snow, and they provide some insulation as well. While a grass cloak might seem primitive, it's actually an effective piece of protective gear for mountain environments, lightweight yet functional. Underneath the cloak, Ötzi wore a coat made from the hides of both domestic goat and wild sheep. The coat was constructed from multiple pieces of leather sewn together in alternating stripes of dark and light colors, creating a pattern that was both decorative and functional. The construction technique involved overlapping pieces, which would have made the garment more weather-resistant. The coat extended to about mid-thigh and had long sleeves. His leggings were separate garments, made from domestic goat hide. Each leg was a separate piece, tied to a belt at the waist. This design allowed for flexibility and ease of movement, important for someone traveling over rough terrain. The leggings extended from the waist to the ankles, providing coverage and warmth for the legs. Perhaps most remarkable were Ötzi's shoes. These were sophisticated pieces of footwear, far more complex than simple hide wraps. The shoes had a bare hide sole, providing durability and traction on rocky surfaces. The upper portion was made from deerskin, and the entire structure was held together with a netting made from tree bast, plant fibers. But the truly ingenious feature was the insulation. The interior of each shoe was stuffed with grass, providing cushioning and insulation against the cold. This is essentially a prehistoric version of insulated boots, showing that people understood the principles of keeping feet warm and comfortable during mountain travel. The shoes were held onto the feet with straps and could be tightened or loosened as needed. The design would have allowed Ötzi to navigate snow, ice, and rocky terrain with relative comfort and stability. When the shoes were first discovered, some researchers initially thought they might have been a type of snowshoe, given the grass filling, but further analysis confirmed they were indeed sophisticated footwear. On his head, Ötzi wore a cap made from brown bear fur, sewn together with sinew. The cap was shaped to fit snugly around the head, providing warmth and some protection from the elements. Bear fur is thick and insulating, an excellent choice for a head covering in cold weather. He also had a belt made from calf leather, which held up his leggings and also served to attach various pouches and tools. The belt had a pouch attached to it containing the small tools and fungus materials mentioned earlier. All of this clothing and equipment demonstrate several important points about Copper Age technology and society. First, people had intimate knowledge of the materials around them, understanding which animal hides were best for different purposes, which plants could be used for fiber, adhesives, or insulation, and how to process and work these materials effectively. Second, the craftsmanship was sophisticated. The sewing, tanning, and construction techniques visible in Ötzi's possessions show skilled workmanship. These were not crude, makeshift items but carefully made tools and garments designed for functionality and durability. Third, there was probably some degree of specialization in production. While Ötzi certainly knew how to maintain and repair his equipment, as evidenced by his unfinished bow and arrows, the complex construction of items like the copper axe and the sophisticated leatherworking in his clothing suggest that specialized craftspeople existed who devoted significant time to perfecting these skills. Finally, the variety of materials used, including copper from Tuscany, demonstrates that trade networks were established and functioning. Ötzi, whether a trader himself or someone who had access to traded goods, was part of a connected world where materials and finished products moved across considerable distances. One aspect of Ötzi that has captured significant scientific and popular interest is his tattoos. The Iceman bears 61 tattoos spread across his body, making him one of the earliest known examples of human tattooing. These marks are not decorative in the modern sense but appear to have served a specific practical purpose related to health and pain management. The tattoos were created by making small incisions in the skin and then rubbing charcoal or soot into the wounds, leaving permanent dark marks as the skin healed. This technique is one of the oldest known methods of tattooing, simple but effective, requiring only basic tools that would have been readily available. What makes Ötzi's tattoos particularly interesting is their placement. They are not located on prominently visible areas like the arms, chest, or face, as one might expect if they were meant for decoration or to display status. Instead, they are concentrated on areas of the body that show signs of wear and disease, specifically over joints and areas of chronic pain. The majority of the tattoos are found on Ötzi's lower back, along his lumbar spine where he had significant degenerative arthritis. There are also clusters of marks on his knees, ankles, and wrists, all joints that showed signs of wear and inflammation. Additional tattoos are located on his calves and along his Achilles tendons, areas that would have experienced stress from walking over mountainous terrain. The correlation between tattoo placement and areas of joint disease is striking and unlikely to be coincidental. This has led researchers to conclude that the tattoos were likely a form of therapeutic treatment, possibly analogous to acupuncture or acupressure. The idea would have been that creating marks or stimulating specific points on the body might relieve pain or treat underlying health conditions. Whether this treatment was actually effective is impossible to know. From a modern medical perspective, tattooing itself wouldn't cure arthritis or other degenerative conditions. However, the process of creating the tattoos might have provided some temporary pain relief through several mechanisms. The trauma of making the incisions might have stimulated the release of endorphins, the body's natural pain-relieving chemicals. The inflammation caused by the tattooing process might have temporarily distracted from or masked chronic pain. Additionally, if there was a belief system that held tattooing to be an effective treatment, there could have been a placebo effect providing psychological relief. What's particularly fascinating is that some of the tattoo locations on Ötzi's body correspond, albeit imperfectly, to acupuncture points used in traditional Chinese medicine. This has sparked considerable debate and speculation. Traditional Chinese acupuncture is documented in texts dating back about 2,000 years, but its actual origins might be much older. The apparent similarity between some of Ötzi's tattoo locations and later acupuncture points raises intriguing questions about whether ancient peoples across different cultures independently discovered similar patterns of body points that seem to influence pain and health. It's important not to overstate this connection. The correlation is not perfect, and many of Ötzi's tattoos don't correspond to known acupuncture points. The placement could simply reflect a pragmatic approach of marking areas that hurt, a kind of put the medicine where the pain is logic that doesn't require sophisticated theoretical understanding. Nonetheless, the tattoos demonstrate that Copper Age people had developed systematic approaches to treating chronic pain and illness. They had medical knowledge, whether based on empirical observation, spiritual beliefs, or a combination of both. Ötzi's tattoos are evidence of medical practice, of people attempting to understand and alleviate suffering using the knowledge and techniques available to them. The number of tattoos, 61, is also significant. This wasn't a single experimental treatment but rather an ongoing therapeutic practice. Ötzi had accumulated these marks over time, likely over years, as different joints developed problems or as pain moved to different locations. Each tattoo represents a moment when he or someone in his community decided to attempt this treatment, a decision made in response to discomfort or disability. The fact that Ötzi continued to acquire tattoos suggests that either the treatment was believed to be effective, or that there were no better alternatives available, or both. In an age without pharmaceuticals, without modern surgical techniques, and without our understanding of pathology, people had to rely on what they could discover through experience and observation. The tattoos also tell us something about social structures. Someone had to create these marks on Ötzi's body, which means there were likely people in his community who specialized in or at least had knowledge of this practice. Whether this was a shaman, a healer, a family member with specific skills, or simply anyone who knew the technique, we can't determine. But the existence of the practice implies shared knowledge, probably passed down through generations, about where and how to place these marks. From an archaeological perspective, Ötzi's tattoos are invaluable. Tattoos rarely survive in the archaeological record because they're on soft tissue, which decomposes. We have indirect evidence of ancient tattooing from tools, pigments, and artistic representations, but actual preserved tattooed skin from such an early period is extraordinarily rare. Ötzi provides direct evidence that people in the Copper Age practiced tattooing and gives us specific information about techniques and purposes. The simple fact that humans 5,300 years ago were modifying their bodies through tattooing connects them to a practice that continues across many cultures to the present day. While our reasons for getting tattoos have evolved and diversified, the basic human impulse to mark and modify the body for various purposes, whether medical, spiritual, decorative, or social, clearly has deep roots in our history. Studying Ötzi's tattoos required careful documentation and analysis. Researchers used various imaging techniques, including infrared photography, which can reveal marks on skin that are difficult to see with the naked eye, especially given the darkening and changes the skin underwent during preservation. Each tattoo was photographed, measured, and mapped onto diagrams of the body to create a complete record. The tattoos varied in form. Most consisted of short parallel lines, typically in groups of 2 to 4 lines. Some were simple crosses. Others were more complex arrangements. The lines ranged from about 2 to 7 centimeters in length. The consistency of the pattern suggests that there was a standardized approach to creating them, a technique or protocol that was followed. The pigment used was carbon-based, either charcoal or soot, materials that would have been readily available from any fire. The method of application, making shallow cuts and rubbing pigment into the wounds, is relatively simple but requires some skill to control the depth and placement to create clear, permanent marks without causing excessive damage or infection. Looking at Ötzi's tattoos, we're seeing not just marks on skin but a window into how ancient people thought about the body, health, and healing. We're seeing evidence of medical practice, of attempts to understand and treat pain, of knowledge being applied in a systematic way. In these simple lines and crosses, there's a connection across millennia, a shared human experience of suffering and the desire to find relief. The night grows deeper, the story continues to unfold, layer by layer, detail by detail, each one adding to our understanding of this man from the distant past. Ötzi was not a simple or primitive person, not a savage struggling in ignorance. He was a human being dealing with the challenges of existence using all the knowledge, skill, and resources available to him. He wore sophisticated clothing, carried well-made tools, understood his environment intimately, and sought treatment for his ailments. He was, in fundamental ways, not so different from us, separated only by time and technology but connected by shared humanity. As you rest tonight, perhaps there's something comforting in that connection. The concerns and challenges that occupied Ötzi's life, staying warm, staying fed, managing pain, traveling safely, are concerns that echo through all of human history. We've found different solutions, better tools, more effective medicines, but the fundamental experiences of being human remain recognizable across the ages. The investigation of Ötzi continued to reveal more secrets, more stories hidden in his body and possessions. Scientists would eventually reconstruct not just his physical characteristics and his equipment, but his final days, his last meals, and ultimately, the violent circumstances of his death. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us first understand more about the context of his life, about the world he lived in and the journeys he made. The analysis of Ötzi's stomach contents provided extraordinary insights into his final days and hours. Unlike most archaeological sites where we can only guess at ancient diets based on what remains don't decay, such as bones and shells, or based on preserved seeds and pollen, Ötzi's frozen body preserved actual food in his digestive system. Researchers were able to extract and analyze the contents of Ötzi's stomach and intestines, identifying specific foods that he had eaten in the hours and days before his death. This provided a rare and detailed snapshot of diet and eating patterns in the Copper Age. The stomach contents analysis revealed several distinct foods. The most recent meal, eaten perhaps just hours before his death, consisted of ibex meat and grain. Ibex are wild mountain goats, well adapted to the steep, rocky terrain of the Alps. Hunting ibex would have required skill, knowledge of their behavior and habitats, and the ability to navigate challenging mountain environments. The presence of ibex meat indicates that Ötzi either hunted and killed an ibex shortly before his death, or that he was traveling with preserved meat from an earlier hunt. The meat was identified through several methods. Muscle fibers were preserved well enough to be examined microscopically, and DNA analysis confirmed the species as alpine ibex, Capra ibex. The meat had been cooked or at least exposed to heat, as evidenced by changes in the protein structure. This wasn't raw meat but prepared food, showing that Ötzi or his companions had taken the time to cook before eating. Along with the meat, there was grain identified as einkorn wheat, an ancient variety of wheat that was one of the first cereals domesticated by humans. Einkorn was widely cultivated in Neolithic and Copper Age Europe. The grain in Ötzi's stomach appeared to have been processed, ground into a coarse meal or flour, possibly baked into a simple flatbread or porridge. There were also traces of other plant materials, including what might have been herbs or wild greens. Interestingly, the analysis revealed a high fat content in the stomach, more than would be expected from lean ibex meat alone. Further investigation identified this as fat from red deer, another large game animal. It's possible that Ötzi had eaten preserved fat, essentially ancient trail food, high-energy provisions that would have been valuable for someone traveling through mountains where weather could turn harsh and physical exertion was constant. The presence of both ibex and red deer in his last meal indicates dietary diversity. Ötzi had access to different food sources, and his diet included both hunted game and cultivated grain. This combination reflects the mixed subsistence strategy of Copper Age communities, which relied on both agriculture and hunting to meet their nutritional needs. Earlier meals could be partially reconstructed from the contents further along in the digestive system. These showed similar patterns: meat, grain, and plant materials. There was evidence of chamois meat as well, another mountain ungulate similar to ibex. The variety suggests that Ötzi was eating opportunistically, consuming what was available as he traveled, whether from hunting, from provisions he carried, or possibly from others he encountered. Pollen analysis provided additional information. Pollen grains from various plants were found in the stomach contents and intestines. Different plants produce pollen at different times of the year and at different altitudes. By identifying which pollens were present and understanding when and where those plants bloom, researchers could reconstruct elements of Ötzi's final journey. The pollen evidence suggested that Ötzi had recently traveled from lower altitudes up into the high mountains. Pollen from trees that grow in valley forests was present, along with pollen from alpine plants that only grow above the tree line. The sequence and types of pollen indicated movement through different ecological zones, ascending from forested areas to the alpine environment where he ultimately died. Moreover, the pollen analysis suggested that these movements happened within a short time frame, probably within 24 to 48 hours of his death. Ötzi had apparently traveled from a lower elevation, where he spent time in or near forests, up to the high pass at over 3,200 meters altitude. This was a significant climb, especially over such a short period, suggesting either urgency or at least determined purpose in his journey. The specific types of pollen also provided seasonal information. The plants whose pollen was found would have been blooming in late spring or early summer, which aligned with the analysis of his death, estimated to have occurred sometime between March and June, with late spring being most likely. This was the season when mountain passes would become accessible as winter snows melted, making it possible to cross from one valley to another. The food and pollen evidence together painted a picture of Ötzi's final days. He had been traveling, moving up from lower valleys into high mountains, eating a combination of hunted meat and grain products, experiencing changing environments as he climbed. The presence of cooked food suggested that he had time to prepare meals, that he wasn't fleeing in complete panic, though the rapidity of his altitude gain did suggest purpose or possibly urgency. One aspect that intrigued researchers was the presence of traces of toxic pollen from the hop hornbeam tree. While small amounts of this pollen could be ingested accidentally, some researchers speculated that Ötzi might have consumed it deliberately. Hop hornbeam has been used in traditional medicine in various cultures, and it's possible that Copper Age people knew of medicinal or practical uses for this plant. However, this remains speculative. The pollen could have been present in water he drank or on food he ate without any intentional ingestion of the plant itself. The reconstruction of Ötzi's diet also provided insights into Copper Age nutrition more broadly. The combination of meat and grain would have provided a good balance of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. The presence of fat, in particular, was important for someone engaged in strenuous physical activity in cold environments. Fat is calorie-dense, providing more than twice the energy per gram compared to protein or carbohydrates, making it an efficient fuel for the body. The grain products would have provided carbohydrates for energy and some protein, along with fiber and various micronutrients. The meat provided complete proteins, essential fats, and important nutrients like iron and B vitamins. If Ötzi's diet was typical of Copper Age peoples, and there's no reason to think it wasn't, then people of this era had reasonably balanced diets when food was available. However, the condition of Ötzi's body, his leanness, and the evidence of dental wear and cavities suggests that while the diet could be nutritious, it wasn't always abundant. Periods of scarcity were likely common, especially in late winter and early spring before new crops were ready and when stored food from the previous year was running low. The seasonal nature of food availability would have been a constant factor in life, influencing decisions about travel, trade, and social interactions. The fact that Ötzi was traveling with food, that he took time to eat, and that his meal included both meat and grain, suggests some level of planning and preparation. He wasn't caught unprepared in the mountains. He had provisions, the ability to hunt or access hunted game, and the means to prepare food. This was someone who knew how to survive in mountain environments, who understood the demands of travel and had equipped himself accordingly. As the analysis of his remains continued, a much darker picture would emerge. Ötzi's journey into the mountains was not a casual trip or a simple trading expedition. His final hours would reveal a story of violence, of injury, and ultimately of death that came not from cold or exhaustion or accident, but from another human being. The mountains had preserved not just a traveler but the victim of a murder, a crime from the deep past that forensic science would eventually uncover and investigators would attempt to understand. But before we reach that conclusion, there are more details to absorb, more aspects of Ötzi's life and world to consider. The evidence from his body, his possessions, and his surroundings continues to accumulate, each piece adding to the mosaic of understanding. We'll examine the circumstances of his death, the theories about what happened and why, and what this violent end tells us about life and conflict in the Copper Age. We'll explore how Ötzi has been preserved for modern study and what ongoing research continues to reveal. And we'll consider what this single individual, frozen in time, can teach us about the human experience across millennia. For now, as you settle deeper into rest, let the details of Ötzi's existence wash over you like gentle waves. A man with worn joints and careful tattoos, carrying a copper axe and unfinished bow, eating ibex meat and ancient wheat, walking up from the valleys into the high peaks where he would take his final breath. A person living a life both foreign and familiar, distant yet somehow close, separated by millennia yet connected by the simple fact of shared humanity. The story continues, unfolding across time, revealed through patient scientific investigation, each discovery bringing us closer to understanding who Ötzi was and what happened to him on that mountain pass more than 5,000 years ago. Rest now, and let your mind drift through the alpine valleys, among the ancient forests and across the high snowy passes where history was made and preserved, waiting for the day when glacial ice would finally release its secret back into the world. The questions surround Ötzi like the mists that often shroud mountain peaks. Who was he? What was his role in his community? Where had he come from, and where was he going? And most pressingly, how did he die, and why? These questions drove researchers to examine every detail, to use every available technique, to extract every possible piece of information from the frozen body and its possessions. The copper axe suggested status. Metal objects were valuable in the Copper Age, requiring specialized knowledge to produce and access to raw materials that might be distant. A person carrying such an axe was likely someone of importance, possibly a leader, a skilled craftsman, a successful trader, or perhaps a warrior. The quality of his clothing and the variety of his equipment also suggested someone who was not impoverished, who had resources or access to resources. Some researchers have speculated that Ötzi might have been a shepherd, leading flocks to high summer pastures. The alpine tradition of transhumance, moving livestock to higher elevations in summer to take advantage of fresh grazing, has ancient roots and might have been practiced even in Ötzi's time. However, there was no direct evidence of Ötzi herding animals, no equipment specifically associated with shepherding, and no clear indication of domesticated animal fibers in his immediate possession beyond what was in his clothing. Others have suggested he might have been a trader, carrying goods between communities on either side of the Alps. The presence of materials from different regions, such as the Tuscan copper, supports the idea that trade networks existed and that people traveled along mountain routes. A trader would have reason to cross high passes and might carry valuable items like the copper axe. Another possibility is that Ötzi was a hunter, pursuing game in the high country. His bow and arrows, though the bow was unfinished, indicate hunting capability. The presence of ibex meat in his stomach, an animal that lives in high alpine terrain, suggests that he was either hunting or traveling with others who were hunting. He might have been a combination of these things. Labels like shepherd, trader, and hunter are modern categories that might not reflect the reality of Copper Age life. People probably engaged in multiple activities depending on the season, opportunity, and need. Ötzi might have hunted, herded, traded, and performed various other roles at different times, as suited the demands of survival and social life in his era. What became increasingly clear as research progressed was that Ötzi's death was not peaceful. Early assumptions that he had perhaps gotten lost, been caught in a storm, frozen to death, or died from exhaustion were systematically dismantled as more detailed examinations revealed evidence of trauma. The first major clue came in 2001, a full decade after the initial discovery, when a new X-ray examination revealed something shocking: an arrowhead lodged in Ötzi's left shoulder. This flint arrowhead had been missed in earlier examinations, perhaps because the X-ray contrast between stone and bone is not dramatic, or perhaps because its presence was simply unexpected. The arrowhead had entered Ötzi's body from behind and to the left, passing between his ribs and striking his subclavian artery, a major blood vessel that supplies blood to the arm and brain. This would have been a devastating injury. Damage to the subclavian artery would cause massive internal bleeding. Within minutes, Ötzi would have gone into shock from blood loss. Without modern surgical intervention, which obviously wasn't available, this injury would have been almost certainly fatal. The arrow had struck from behind, indicating that Ötzi was either fleeing from his attacker or was shot without warning, possibly while unaware of the danger. The angle and position suggested that the archer was below and behind Ötzi when the shot was made, which makes sense given the terrain. Someone ascending the mountain behind Ötzi would have been lower on the slope. Further examination revealed additional evidence of violence. There were cuts on Ötzi's hands, particularly on his right hand and wrist. These were deep wounds, defensive injuries consistent with someone trying to protect themselves or grappling with an attacker. The wounds showed some signs of healing, suggesting they had been inflicted hours or perhaps even a day or two before his death, though not long enough to have healed completely. CT scans of Ötzi's skull revealed trauma to the back of the head. There was a fracture and associated hemorrhaging in the brain tissue, indicating a significant blow. This head injury alone could have been fatal or at least incapacitating. The question arose, which came first, the arrow or the head trauma? And were there other injuries not yet discovered? The most widely accepted reconstruction, based on the forensic evidence, is that Ötzi was involved in some kind of violent confrontation before his death. The hand wounds suggest close combat, possibly hand-to-hand fighting or defending against a knife or blade. After escaping this initial confrontation, Ötzi fled into the mountains, ascending to the high pass where he was eventually found. His attacker or attackers pursued him. At some point during this flight, or perhaps after Ötzi thought he was safe, an archer shot him from behind with an arrow. The arrow struck his shoulder, causing the catastrophic arterial injury. Ötzi might have stumbled or fallen after being hit. The head trauma could have resulted from hitting his head on a rock when he fell, or it could have been inflicted by his attacker catching up to him and striking him. Ötzi then either died immediately or crawled or was placed into the shallow depression where his body was found. He lay down, perhaps losing consciousness from blood loss and shock, and there he died. Snow soon covered him, and the processes of freezing and preservation began. One detail that has puzzled researchers is that the arrow shaft was apparently removed. The arrowhead remained in Ötzi's body, but there was no sign of the wooden shaft that would have been attached to it. In combat or hunting, arrows often break, leaving the head embedded while the shaft snaps off. However, the position and condition of the arrowhead suggest that it might have been deliberately pulled out, broken off, or otherwise separated from its shaft. Why would someone take the time to remove the arrow shaft? One theory is that the attacker wanted to retrieve their arrow, both because arrows were valuable items requiring time and skill to make, and because an intact arrow might identify the killer. Different arrow makers had distinctive styles, and arrows might have been as identifying as a signature. By removing the shaft, the killer might have been trying to conceal their identity. Alternatively, the shaft might have broken off during Ötzi's movements after being shot, or during his fall, or through natural processes after death but before complete freezing. The exact sequence of events remains uncertain, but the deliberate removal theory has gained traction because of the apparent care with which the shaft was separated from the head. The question that naturally arises is, why was Ötzi killed? What motivated this act of violence in the Copper Age Alps? Without written records or testimony, we can only speculate based on the evidence and our understanding of human behavior and ancient societies. Several theories have been proposed. One possibility is that Ötzi was the victim of a robbery. He carried valuable items, particularly the copper axe. Someone might have decided to kill him to steal these possessions. However, this theory has a significant problem. The copper axe and other valuable items were still with Ötzi's body. If robbery was the motive, why didn't the killer take these things? Perhaps the killer was interrupted, or perhaps they couldn't find the body after it was covered by snow. Or perhaps robbery wasn't the motive after all. Another theory suggests tribal or community conflict. Ötzi might have been a member of one group who was killed by members of another group due to territorial disputes, resource competition, revenge for past wrongs, or other intergroup tensions. The hand wounds could indicate that he was involved in a raid or battle, and the arrow that killed him was part of that same conflict or a continuation of it. Some researchers have speculated about more personal motives. Ötzi might have been killed due to a personal dispute, over a woman, over property, over status, or any of the countless reasons that humans come into conflict. The fact that he was apparently pursued into the mountains suggests a personal element, that someone was specifically targeting him rather than engaging in random violence. There's also the possibility of ritual or sacrifice, though there's no strong evidence for this. The care with which Ötzi's body was positioned, if indeed it was positioned by someone else, and the items left with him don't clearly indicate ritual killing, but we can't entirely rule it out based on our incomplete understanding of Copper Age spiritual practices. The truth is we may never know for certain why Ötzi was killed. What we do know is that someone shot him with an arrow, causing a fatal injury, and that he had been involved in violent confrontation shortly before his death. This violence was apparently targeted at him specifically, as evidenced by the pursuit into the mountains. The killing appears to have been intentional, not an accident or a case of mistaken identity. What Ötzi's violent death does tell us, unambiguously, is that the Copper Age was not a time of universal peace. Violence between individuals and groups was a reality of life. People had weapons, they knew how to use them, and sometimes they used them against other people. This shouldn't surprise us. Conflict is a sadly consistent feature of human societies across all times and places. But the forensic evidence from Ötzi's body transforms ancient violence from an abstract concept into a concrete, documented event. We can see in Ötzi's wounds the same tragic story that has played out countless times throughout history, one person deciding to harm another, the immediate physical violence, the fear and pain of the victim, the finality of death. Ötzi's story is unique in its preservation and the scientific attention it has received, but the underlying human drama is timeless and universal. As the night deepens and you drift closer to sleep, perhaps there's a somber lesson in Ötzi's fate. The challenges we face, the conflicts that arise, the capacity for both cooperation and violence, these are not new features of human existence invented by modern civilization. They reach back through all of recorded history and beyond, into the prehistoric past where people like Ötzi lived lives filled with the same spectrum of experiences that characterize human existence today. Ötzi's murder also adds a layer of poignancy to his preservation. He didn't choose to become a scientific specimen or a symbol of ancient history. He was someone who died violently, probably terrified and in pain, far from home, his life cut short by another's actions. The ice preserved not just a body but the evidence of a crime, a terrible moment frozen in time. Yet through this preservation, Ötzi has achieved a kind of immortality. His name, a modern invention derived from the Ötztal Alps where he was found, is known around the world. His story has been told countless times, his body studied by generations of scientists, his image and artifacts displayed for millions of visitors. In death, he has become a teacher, showing us what life was like in an age so distant it strains imagination. The preservation of Ötzi the Iceman stands as one of the great achievements of modern conservation science. When his body was first recovered from the ice, researchers faced an unprecedented challenge. Here was a 5,300-year-old mummy, preserved by natural freezing, with skin, organs, and soft tissues intact. Maintaining this preservation while allowing scientific study required developing entirely new approaches to conservation. The immediate concern after Ötzi's recovery was preventing deterioration. Once removed from the ice, the body was vulnerable to bacterial growth, fungal infection, and the physical damage that occurs when frozen tissues thaw. Initially, the body was kept in a cold room at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Innsbruck, where it was held at temperatures just below freezing and high humidity to prevent drying. However, this was only a temporary solution. For long-term preservation, a more sophisticated approach was needed. Scientists studied the conditions under which Ötzi had been naturally preserved for millennia, trying to understand exactly what physical processes had maintained his body in such remarkable condition. The natural preservation involved freeze-drying. Ötzi had died and been quickly covered by snow, which protected his body from scavengers and insects. The ice that formed around him created a sealed environment with very low temperatures. Over time, the ice directly surrounding his body sublimated, meaning it transformed from solid ice directly into water vapor without melting into liquid first. This sublimation slowly removed moisture from Ötzi's tissues while the cold prevented decay. The result was a body that had lost most of its water content but retained its structure. Ötzi's tissues had become leathery and shrunken, but they hadn't decomposed or disintegrated. The skin, though darkened and toughened, was intact. Internal organs, though reduced and altered, were still recognizable. This freeze-dried state was stable as long as conditions remained cold and dry. To maintain Ötzi in the long term, scientists decided to mimic these natural preservation conditions as closely as possible. The solution was to create a specialized cold storage chamber that would keep the body frozen while maintaining specific humidity levels. In 1998, Ötzi was transferred to his permanent home at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy. The museum had constructed a special cold cell specifically designed to house the Iceman. This chamber maintains a constant temperature of -6 degrees Celsius, about 21 degrees Fahrenheit, and humidity levels of 98 to 99%. These conditions replicate the environment inside the glacier where Ötzi had lain for millennia. The high humidity is crucial. If the air were too dry, Ötzi's already desiccated tissues would continue to lose moisture and eventually become brittle and fragile. The cold prevents bacterial and fungal growth that would otherwise consume the organic material. Together, these conditions keep Ötzi stable, preventing further decay while maintaining the body in a state that allows for careful scientific examination. The cold cell is actually a sophisticated piece of engineering. It consists of two chambers separated by an insulated door. The outer chamber serves as an airlock, allowing researchers to enter and exit without significantly affecting the temperature and humidity in the inner chamber where Ötzi rests. The cooling and humidity systems are redundant, with backup systems ready to engage if the primary systems fail. Alarm systems monitor conditions constantly, alerting staff immediately if there's any deviation from the optimal parameters. Ötzi lies in the inner chamber on a specially designed steel framework that supports his body while minimizing contact points that could cause pressure damage. The body is positioned much as it was found, lying on its front with the head turned to the side. Every few months, a fine mist of sterile water is sprayed over the body to maintain the humidity of the tissues themselves and prevent any drying that could cause cracking or other damage. Museum visitors can view Ötzi through a small window in the cold cell door. They look into the dimly lit chamber where the Iceman rests, seeing the dark, leathery body preserved from the Copper Age. This viewing window allows public access while maintaining the environmental integrity of the preservation chamber. Visitors spend just a few moments at the window, enough to see the body and perhaps feel the weight of the millennia that separate them from this ancient individual, but not so long that a queue forms or that the chamber's environment is stressed by prolonged door openings. Adjacent to the cold cell, the museum has extensive exhibits displaying Ötzi's equipment, clothing, and artifacts, along with detailed information about the discovery, the scientific investigations, and the findings about Copper Age life. There are reconstructions showing what Ötzi might have looked like in life, diagrams explaining the preservation process, and displays of the scientific techniques used to study him. The museum also maintains a laboratory where ongoing research continues. Scientists from around the world come to Bolzano to study Ötzi, proposing research projects that are reviewed by a scientific committee. If approved, researchers are granted access to the body or to samples for specific analyses. This controlled access ensures that research continues while protecting the irreplaceable remains from unnecessary handling or destructive sampling. Every examination of Ötzi must be carefully planned. The cold cell cannot be opened frequently or for extended periods without risking damage to the preservation environment. When researchers need to examine the body directly, the cold cell is opened, and the scientists, wearing protective clothing appropriate for the cold conditions, work quickly and efficiently to conduct their studies. Examinations are often performed using non-invasive or minimally invasive techniques to avoid damaging the body. Photography, including regular, infrared, and ultraviolet imaging, allows detailed documentation without physical contact. X-rays and CT scans can be performed with the body remaining in the cold cell or moved carefully to scanning equipment in controlled conditions. These imaging techniques have become increasingly sophisticated over the years, allowing researchers to see details that would have been invisible with earlier technology. When tissue samples are needed for chemical, genetic, or microscopic analysis, they are taken as small as possible, typically just a few milligrams of material. These tiny samples are sufficient for modern analytical techniques, which can extract enormous amounts of information from minute quantities of tissue. The samples are removed using sterile instruments, and the sampling sites are carefully documented so that future researchers know exactly what has been taken and from where. The DNA analysis of Ötzi, for instance, required only tiny samples of bone and tissue. From these small amounts, scientists were able to sequence significant portions of his genome, revealing information about his ancestry, his physical characteristics, his predisposition to certain diseases, and his relationships to modern and ancient populations. As DNA sequencing technology has improved, samples taken years ago have been reanalyzed using newer techniques, yielding additional information without requiring new samples to be taken. The conservation of Ötzi is an ongoing process, not a one-time treatment. Museum staff monitor the cold cell continuously, checking temperature and humidity, inspecting the body for any signs of degradation, and maintaining the equipment that keeps the environment stable. This vigilance is essential because any failure in the preservation system could result in rapid deterioration of the body. If temperatures rose above freezing, bacterial growth could begin within hours. If humidity dropped too low, tissues could dry out and crack. The responsibility of maintaining this 5,300-year-old human being is taken with utmost seriousness. There have been challenges over the years. Fungal growth was detected on Ötzi's body in the early 2000s, a worrying development that threatened the preservation. The fungi were apparently introduced during the original recovery when the body was in contact with non-sterile tools and conditions. The cold storage had slowed the fungal growth but not entirely stopped it. Treating the fungal contamination required careful planning. The fungi couldn't be allowed to spread, but treatment options were limited because harsh chemical treatments could damage Ötzi's tissues. After consultation with conservation specialists and microbiologists, the decision was made to treat the affected areas with a dilute ethanol solution, which could kill the fungi without causing excessive damage to the skin and tissues. The treatment was applied carefully, and the affected areas were monitored closely afterward. The treatment was successful, and the fungal growth was eliminated. This incident highlighted the delicate balance involved in preserving Ötzi. The conditions that prevent bacterial and fungal growth in living organisms, such as immune system responses and higher body temperatures, are obviously not present in a mummified body. The cold storage is the primary defense against microbial degradation, but it must be maintained perfectly, and any contamination must be addressed quickly. The dedication to preserving Ötzi reflects his enormous scientific value. He is, quite literally, irreplaceable. No other naturally preserved human from the Copper Age exists in comparable condition. Every year, new questions arise, new technologies become available, and new studies are proposed. Researchers continue to discover information from Ötzi's body decades after the initial discovery, information that helps us understand ancient health, genetics, technology, and culture. The museum in Bolzano has become a pilgrimage site for archaeologists, historians, scientists, and curious visitors from around the world. Since opening, millions of people have viewed Ötzi and learned about the Copper Age through the exhibits. The museum provides not just preservation but also education, making Ötzi's story accessible to the public and inspiring interest in archaeology and human history. For many visitors, seeing Ötzi is a profound experience. There's something deeply moving about standing before the actual body of a person who lived more than 5,000 years ago. It's not a reconstruction, not an artist's interpretation, not a collection of bones in a display case, but an actual human being, preserved with skin and features visible, lying as he died on that mountain pass so long ago. The museum staff are aware of the emotional impact of viewing Ötzi and have designed the exhibit to respect both the scientific significance and the human dignity of the remains. The viewing window is positioned to allow a clear but respectful view. The lighting in the cold cell is kept low, which helps with preservation but also creates an atmosphere of reverence. Information panels explain who Ötzi was, how he died, and what we've learned from him, framing the experience in educational terms while acknowledging the individual humanity of the person being viewed. There are ethical considerations in displaying human remains, questions about consent, dignity, and respect. Ötzi cannot consent to being on display or being subjected to scientific study. He comes from a culture so distant and so different from our own that we cannot know what beliefs he held about death, the body, or the afterlife. The general consensus among archaeologists and ethicists involved with Ötzi is that the scientific and educational value of studying and displaying his remains justifies the practice, provided it's done respectfully. The knowledge gained from Ötzi benefits humanity by expanding our understanding of our collective past. The display educates people about archaeology, history, and science. These benefits are weighed against the concerns about disturbing the dead and displaying human remains. The museum maintains that Ötzi is treated with respect, that the display is educational rather than sensationalistic, and that the ongoing research follows ethical guidelines. Sampling is minimized, and only research projects with clear scientific merit are approved. The cold cell environment is maintained not just for preservation but to provide Ötzi with a kind of dignified resting place, albeit one that allows for viewing and study. As research techniques continue to advance, Ötzi's body continues to yield new information. Each new generation of scientific technology brings new possibilities for analysis. In the 1990s, researchers could perform DNA analysis, but it was limited and crude by today's standards. Now, full genome sequencing is possible, revealing information that couldn't have been imagined when Ötzi was first discovered. Similarly, CT scanning technology has advanced dramatically. The first CT scans of Ötzi were relatively low resolution, but modern scanners can create incredibly detailed three-dimensional images of his body, showing internal structures with remarkable clarity. These newer scans have revealed details about his injuries, his bone structure, and his internal organs that weren't visible in earlier examinations. Chemical analysis techniques have also improved. Researchers can now detect and identify tiny traces of substances, allowing them to determine what Ötzi ate with greater precision, what materials his clothing was made from, where those materials originated, and even what chemicals he was exposed to during his life. Isotope analysis of his teeth and bones can trace where he grew up and where he spent different periods of his life based on the chemical signatures of the water and food he consumed. Each new finding adds to the story. The accumulation of data from decades of research has transformed Ötzi from a curiosity into a comprehensive case study of an individual from the distant past. We know more about Ötzi than we know about almost any other person who lived before written records. We know his age, his health conditions, his diet, his injuries, his genetic makeup, his clothing, his tools, and the circumstances of his death. This level of detail for a single individual from 5,300 years ago is unprecedented. Usually, archaeology deals with populations and generalizations. We might say, people in this region during this period used these kinds of tools and had this type of diet, based on collections of artifacts and remains from many individuals and sites. But with Ötzi, we can speak specifically about one person, about his individual characteristics and experiences. This specificity makes Ötzi particularly valuable for understanding the range of variation in ancient populations. He shows us one example of what a person from the Copper Age was like, which can be compared with other evidence to understand what was typical and what was individual. His genetic profile, for instance, shows a particular lineage that was apparently once more common in Europe but is now rare, helping us understand how European populations have changed over time through migrations and genetic drift. The isotope analysis of Ötzi's teeth reveals that he grew up in one particular valley but spent time in several different locations during his life. This tells us about mobility and movement in the Copper Age, showing that people didn't necessarily remain in one village their entire lives but moved around, whether for trade, marriage, seasonal migrations, or other reasons. The wear patterns on his teeth and joints tell us about the physical demands of his lifestyle. The parasites in his gut tell us about sanitation and hygiene. The soot in his lungs tells us about indoor air quality and fire use. Every detail contributes to a richer, more nuanced understanding of what life was actually like in the Copper Age. The scientific research on Ötzi has spanned multiple disciplines, involving archaeologists, forensic pathologists, geneticists, radiologists, chemists, botanists, entomologists, conservation scientists, and many other specialists. This interdisciplinary approach has been essential because no single field could have extracted all the information that Ötzi contains. The collaboration has also been international. Scientists from Austria, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, the United States, and many other countries have participated in Ötzi research. This reflects both the international interest in the discovery and the collaborative nature of modern science, where expertise is often distributed across institutions and countries, and major projects bring together specialists from wherever they are needed. The publications resulting from Ötzi research number in the hundreds. Scientific papers have been published in journals across multiple disciplines, describing findings about his genetics, his health, his diet, his clothing, his tools, the preservation process, and countless other aspects. There have been books written for both academic and general audiences, documentaries produced, museum exhibits created, and educational materials developed. Ötzi has become one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in the world, recognized far beyond academic circles. People who might not be able to name any other archaeological find often know about Ötzi the Iceman. This fame has helped raise public awareness of archaeology and has demonstrated the value of careful scientific investigation of ancient remains. The economic impact on the region has been significant as well. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology has become a major tourist attraction, drawing visitors to Bolzano who might not otherwise have visited. This has brought tourism revenue to the region and has helped support the local economy. The fame of Ötzi has become a source of regional pride, with the Iceman featuring in local tourism marketing and becoming a symbol of the area's deep history. There have been lighter moments in the Ötzi story as well. The Iceman has appeared in popular culture in various ways, from serious documentaries to novelty items. There have been theories and speculations, some more credible than others, about everything from Ötzi's social status to supposed curses associated with people involved in the discovery and study. The curse of Ötzi idea, similar to the curse of King Tut's tomb, emerged when several people connected to the discovery died in subsequent years. Of course, this is simply coincidence. People die, and when you look for patterns, you can find them even where none exist. Scientists involved with Ötzi have generally dismissed the curse idea with good humor, though it has added an element of mystery that captures public imagination. More seriously, there have been ongoing questions and research into specific aspects of Ötzi's story that remain incompletely understood. The exact purpose of his journey into the mountains remains uncertain. Was he fleeing from attackers? Was he pursuing someone? Was he on a routine trading or herding trip that went wrong? The evidence suggests urgency in his final movements, given the rapid altitude gain indicated by pollen analysis, but the specific circumstances remain open to interpretation. The identity of his killer or killers also remains unknown and unknowable. We know he was killed, we know roughly how, but we cannot know by whom or exactly why. This mystery adds a human drama to the scientific facts, a story of ancient violence that will never be fully resolved. There are also questions about the broader context of Ötzi's life. What was his community like? Where exactly did he live? What was his social position? While we can make informed guesses based on his possessions and the archaeological evidence from the period and region, we cannot know specifics. His community, his family, his friends, the specific places he knew, all of this is lost to time, preserved nowhere except perhaps in traces of DNA and isotopes that hint at connections and movements but cannot tell us about relationships and emotions. The ongoing research continues to address both large and small questions. Major research projects have used cutting-edge technology to extract new information. Smaller studies have examined specific details, like the construction techniques used in his clothing, or the species of wood used in his fire-starting kit, or the minerals in his copper axe. The analysis of Ötzi's clothing alone has occupied numerous researchers over the years. Each garment represents a window into Copper Age textile technology, material knowledge, and cultural practices. The leather used in his coat, for instance, was analyzed to determine not just what animals it came from but how the hides were processed. Tanning leather is a complex process that transforms raw hide, which would otherwise rot or become stiff and brittle, into durable, flexible material suitable for clothing. Ancient tanning methods typically involve treating hides with various substances. Some cultures used tannins from tree bark, hence the term tanning. Others used oils, smoke, or other materials. Analysis of Ötzi's leather showed evidence of animal fats and possibly smoke treatment, suggesting that his community used these preservation techniques. The leather had weathered remarkably well over the millennia it spent frozen, testament to the quality of the original processing. The sewing techniques visible in Ötzi's garments demonstrate skilled craftsmanship. The stitches are relatively even and carefully placed, using sinew or plant fiber thread. The construction shows understanding of how different pieces should be assembled to create functional, durable clothing. Some seams are overlapped to prevent water penetration. Others are positioned to reduce stress on the material during movement. These aren't random constructions but thoughtfully designed garments. The grass cloak that Ötzi wore over his other clothing has been extensively studied. The grasses used were identified as belonging to species that still grow in alpine regions today. The grasses were harvested, dried, and then woven together in an overlapping pattern similar to thatching on a roof. This construction allows water to run off rather than soaking through, providing weather protection. The cloak would have been relatively lightweight, important for someone traveling on foot, yet effective at shedding rain and snow. Creating such a cloak required knowledge of which grasses were suitable, when to harvest them for optimal properties, how to prepare them, and how to weave them into a functional garment. This represents accumulated traditional knowledge, the kind of information that would have been passed down through generations, learned by watching and doing, refined through experience. The shoes, those remarkable pieces of footwear with their bearskin soles and grass insulation, have been the subject of particular fascination. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to recreate Ötzi's shoes using the same materials and techniques visible in the originals. These experiments have demonstrated both the challenges of construction and the functionality of the design. Making the shoes requires obtaining suitable hides, processing them, cutting them to the right shapes, and sewing them together with precision. The grass insulation must be gathered, prepared, and packed into the shoe in a way that provides cushioning and warmth without compacting too much or creating uncomfortable lumps. The netting that holds the structure together must be strong enough to withstand the stresses of walking but flexible enough to allow the foot to move naturally. Those who have worn replicas of Ötzi's shoes report that they are surprisingly comfortable and functional. The grass insulation provides genuine warmth even in cold conditions. The bearskin sole is durable and provides good traction. The overall design, while different from modern footwear, represents a sophisticated solution to the problem of protecting and insulating the feet during mountain travel. The copper axe has been examined from multiple angles. Metallurgical analysis determined the composition of the metal, revealing it to be approximately 99% pure copper with trace amounts of other elements. This level of purity indicates that the copper ore used was of high quality and that the smelting process was well controlled. The trace elements serve as a fingerprint, allowing researchers to match the composition to specific ore sources. The discovery that the copper came from Tuscany, over 500 kilometers to the south, raised important questions about Copper Age Europe. How did the copper travel this distance? Was it traded as raw ore, as refined metal, or as finished objects? What did people trade in exchange for copper? How extensive were the trade networks? Archaeological evidence from various Copper Age sites throughout Europe shows that trade networks were indeed extensive. Goods moved along river valleys, across mountain passes, and along coastlines. Certain materials, such as high-quality flint, obsidian, amber, shells, and copper, traveled hundreds of kilometers from their sources. This movement implies organized trade, with people specializing in transporting goods, and communities developing relationships with distant partners. The presence of Tuscan copper in the Alps suggests that Ötzi's community was connected to these broader networks. Whether Ötzi himself was a trader or simply benefited from trade conducted by others, he clearly had access to goods that originated far from his home region. This challenges any notion of Copper Age communities being isolated or primitive. They were connected, networked, engaged in economic and social relationships that extended across considerable distances. The weapons that Ötzi carried, the bow and arrows, represent another area of detailed study. The yew longbow, though unfinished, is of a type that would remain in use in Europe for thousands of years. English longbows, famous from medieval warfare, were made using similar principles, selecting yew wood and exploiting its natural properties to create powerful, efficient weapons. The unfinished state of Ötzi's bow has led to speculation about his immediate circumstances. Was he in the process of making a new bow? Had his previous bow been damaged or lost? The fact that he was carrying an unfinished bow suggests that he either left home before completing it, implying urgency, or that he was working on it while traveling, which would be unusual given the specialized tools and time required for proper bow making. The 2 finished arrows in his quiver represent considerable investment in time and skill. Each arrow required selecting straight wood, shaping it precisely, creating and attaching the flint point, adding fletching, and ensuring that the entire assembly was balanced and straight. An arrow that wobbles in flight or is poorly balanced will not fly accurately. The care taken in making Ötzi's arrows shows that he or his community understood these requirements. Flint knapping, the technique used to create the arrowheads, is itself a highly skilled craft. It involves striking a piece of flint with another stone or antler tool to remove flakes, gradually shaping the stone into a sharp, symmetrical point. A skilled knapper can create beautiful, functional points with remarkable consistency. The points in Ötzi's arrows show good craftsmanship, symmetrical and sharp, suitable for penetrating animal hide. The presence of unfinished arrow shafts in the quiver is interesting. These blanks could have been intended for future arrow making, or they could have been spare shafts to replace damaged ones. Arrows break relatively easily, especially the wooden shaft, while the flint point might remain intact. Carrying spare shafts would allow a hunter to repair arrows in the field, maintaining a supply of functional weapons without needing to return home. All of this equipment, the clothing, the tools, the weapons, the containers, represents a material culture that was sophisticated and well adapted to alpine environments. The people who created these items understood their materials intimately. They knew which woods were best for different purposes, how to process hides, how to work copper, how to knap flint, how to weave grass, and how to combine all of these elements into functional, durable goods. This knowledge was not written down. There were no instruction manuals, no books, no diagrams. Everything was learned through observation, practice, and oral instruction. Children would have watched adults working, learned by imitating, made mistakes, improved, and eventually passed their knowledge to the next generation. This oral and practical transmission of knowledge was the primary educational method for most of human history. The sophistication of Copper Age material culture, as exemplified by Ötzi's possessions, demonstrates that ancient peoples were not less intelligent than modern humans. They simply had different knowledge bases, focused on different technologies. A Copper Age person might not understand electricity or computers, but they understood materials, ecology, and practical craftsmanship in ways that most modern people do not. If you were transported back to the Copper Age with nothing but your modern knowledge, you would likely struggle to survive. Unless you happen to know how to make stone tools, process hides, identify edible plants, track animals, and perform dozens of other practical skills, your theoretical knowledge about science and technology would be largely useless. Ötzi, on the other hand, had the knowledge needed to thrive in his environment. He knew how to survive, how to make what he needed, how to navigate his world. This realization should instill respect for ancient peoples and recognition that intelligence and capability are not the same as technological advancement. Humans have been intelligent throughout our species' existence. What has changed is the accumulation of knowledge and technology, built up over countless generations, each adding their innovations and discoveries to the collective human store. Ötzi benefited from thousands of years of accumulated knowledge that came before him. The techniques for making stone tools had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years. The domestication of plants and animals represented millennia of selection and breeding. The development of copper metallurgy was a relatively recent innovation in Ötzi's time, but it too built on earlier discoveries about fire, about ores, about shaping and using materials. Similarly, we benefit from all the knowledge accumulated since Ötzi's time, including everything his culture knew plus the discoveries of every generation since. We stand on the shoulders of giants, as the saying goes, but so did Ötzi. He was part of a long chain of human knowledge and experience, neither the beginning nor the end, but a link in an ongoing process. One particularly interesting line of research has focused on Ötzi's microbiome, the bacteria and other microorganisms that lived in and on his body. Modern humans carry trillions of microorganisms, collectively called the microbiome, which play important roles in digestion, immune function, and health. By analyzing ancient bacteria preserved in Ötzi's gut, researchers have been able to learn about the microbiomes of ancient peoples. The bacterial DNA extracted from Ötzi's stomach has been sequenced, revealing which species were present. Helicobacter pylori, a bacterium that commonly infects human stomachs today and is associated with ulcers and stomach cancer, was found in Ötzi. The specific strain of H. pylori that Ötzi carried was of a type that's now more common in Asia than in Europe, providing clues about ancient population movements and the evolution of bacterial strains. This kind of research demonstrates how Ötzi continues to provide insights into questions that weren't even being asked when he was first discovered. The study of ancient microbiomes is a relatively new field, made possible by advances in DNA sequencing technology. Ötzi's preserved gut contents provide rare material for this research, and the findings contribute to understanding how human-associated microbiomes have changed over time. Another area of ongoing interest is the reconstruction of Ötzi's appearance. Artists and forensic specialists have created multiple reconstructions of what Ötzi might have looked like in life. These reconstructions are based on the structure of his skull, the information about his genetic characteristics, and comparisons with modern people from similar genetic backgrounds. The reconstructions show a middle-aged man with weather-worn features, dark hair and eyes, and a lean face. He's often depicted with a beard, though we cannot know for certain whether he wore one since facial hair doesn't preserve well. Different artists have created slightly different interpretations, reflecting both the ambiguities in the evidence and different artistic approaches. These reconstructions serve several purposes. They help the public visualize Ötzi as a real person rather than just a leathery mummy. They're used in museum exhibits and documentaries to create a more immediate connection between viewers and this ancient individual. And they represent the best scientific efforts to recreate a face from 5,300 years ago. Of course, any reconstruction involves interpretation and uncertainty. We can estimate features based on bone structure, but soft tissue details like the exact shape of the nose, the fullness of the lips, the precise appearance of the eyes, these involve educated guessing. The reconstruction should be understood as plausible representations rather than exact likenesses. What we know for certain is that Ötzi was a person, someone who looked out at the world through eyes that saw landscapes we can still visit, who felt the same sun and wind that still blow across alpine peaks, who experienced hunger, pain, cold, warmth, fatigue, rest, and all the physical sensations that define embodied existence. The distance of millennia separates us from him, but the shared experience of being human connects us. The study of ancient DNA from Ötzi has opened extraordinary windows into human history and prehistory. When scientists first attempted to extract DNA from Ötzi in the 1990s, the technology was still relatively primitive by today's standards. Early results were limited and sometimes contaminated with modern DNA from people who had handled the body. As DNA extraction and sequencing technologies improved, more sophisticated analyses became possible. By the 2010s, researchers were able to sequence significant portions of Ötzi's genome, the complete set of his genetic information. This represented a major achievement because ancient DNA is typically degraded, broken into small fragments by the passage of time and the physical processes of decay. Even in Ötzi's well-preserved body, the DNA had been damaged by millennia of freezing and the chemical changes that occur in dead tissue. The sequencing revealed Ötzi's genetic ancestry, showing that he belonged to haplogroups that are now relatively rare in Europe. His Y chromosome, inherited through the paternal line, belonged to haplogroup G2A. In modern populations, this haplogroup is found at low frequencies across Europe, with slightly higher frequencies in some Mediterranean and Middle Eastern populations. The fact that Ötzi carried this haplogroup tells us that the genetic makeup of European populations has changed considerably over the past 5,000 years. Population genetic studies suggest that Europe has experienced several major migrations and population turnovers since the Copper Age. The Bronze Age saw significant movements of people from the steppes of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, bringing new genes, languages, and cultures. Later, various groups including Celts, Romans, Germanic tribes, Slavs, and many others moved across Europe, mixing with existing populations and altering the genetic landscape. Ötzi's genome represents a snapshot of European genetics before these later changes, showing us something about the people who lived in Europe during the Neolithic and Copper Age. His genetic profile is closer to that of early European farmers, people who had migrated into Europe from the Near East thousands of years before Ötzi's time, bringing agriculture with them and largely replacing or mixing with the hunter-gatherer populations that had inhabited Europe since the Ice Age. The study of Ötzi's DNA also revealed information about his physical characteristics. Genetic markers associated with eye color suggested he had brown eyes, the most common eye color worldwide and likely the ancestral state for humans. Skin color genes indicated he probably had somewhat darker skin than many modern Northern Europeans, possibly closer to the complexion common in Southern Europe today. His hair color was likely dark brown or black, though this could also be inferred from the hair samples found with his body. Interestingly, Ötzi appears to have been lactose intolerant. The genetic variant that allows adults to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, was apparently not present in his genome. This is significant because it tells us about the evolution of lactose tolerance in European populations. The ability for adults to digest milk is actually a relatively recent genetic adaptation, arising in populations that practiced dairy farming and therefore had an advantage if they could consume milk throughout life rather than just in childhood. In Ötzi's time, dairy farming was practiced, sheep and goats were kept partly for their milk, but apparently the genetic adaptation for adult lactose digestion had not yet become common in alpine populations. This would change over the subsequent millennia as the genetic variant that permits lactose tolerance spread through European farming populations because of the nutritional advantages it provided. The genome also revealed information about disease predispositions. Ötzi carried genetic variants associated with increased risk of coronary artery disease, and indeed CT scans showed that he had calcifications in his arteries consistent with atherosclerosis. This was a valuable finding for modern medicine, demonstrating that cardiovascular disease is not purely a product of modern lifestyles but has a significant genetic component that can affect people even in the absence of processed foods, sedentary behavior, and other contemporary risk factors. There were also genetic markers associated with Lyme disease susceptibility, and DNA from the Lyme disease bacteria was found in Ötzi's tissues. This made him the earliest known case of Lyme disease, proving that this tick-borne illness has been affecting humans for at least 5,300 years. Understanding the ancient distribution and evolution of diseases helps scientists track how pathogens have changed over time and how they have spread. The study of Ötzi's genome is ongoing. As sequencing technology continues to improve and as our understanding of the human genome expands, researchers can return to the data already collected and extract new information. Genes that we didn't know were important for certain traits or diseases when the genome was first sequenced can now be examined to see what variants Ötzi carried. Additionally, comparisons with other ancient genomes help place Ötzi in a broader context. As more ancient DNA is sequenced from skeletons and mummies from different times and places, we can trace migrations, admixture events, and genetic changes across the millennia. Ötzi serves as a reference point for what European genetics looked like in the Copper Age, allowing comparisons with earlier and later populations. The field of ancient genomics has exploded in recent years. Thousands of ancient genomes have now been sequenced, from individuals spanning from the Paleolithic to historical periods. This data is revolutionizing our understanding of human history, revealing population movements, interactions, and replacements that were invisible in the archaeological record alone. Ötzi was among the first ancient individuals to have his genome sequenced, making him a pioneer case study that helped establish methods and interpretative frameworks for the entire field. The cultural impact of Ötzi extends beyond science and museums. He has influenced art, literature, music, and popular imagination. There have been novels written imagining his life, films, and television programs exploring his story, artistic works inspired by his image and his fate. Various authors have created fictional narratives around Ötzi, imagining the details of his life, his relationships, his community, and the circumstances that led to his death. Some of these works aim for historical accuracy, using archaeological evidence to create plausible scenarios. Others take more creative liberties, using Ötzi as a starting point for adventure, mystery, or speculative fiction. Documentaries about Ötzi have been produced by major television networks and streaming services, bringing his story to audiences worldwide. These programs typically combine dramatic reenactments with scientific explanations, showing both the imagined life of Ötzi and the real research being conducted on his remains. The visual medium allows viewers to see the alpine landscapes where Ötzi lived and died, to watch recreations of Copper Age life, and to witness the scientific techniques used to study the body. In the region where he was found, Ötzi has become a cultural icon. His image appears in local media, tourism materials, and even commercial products. There's an Ötzi brand of beer, various souvenirs and mementos, and countless references in local culture. This commercialization might seem at odds with the scientific seriousness of the research, but it reflects the genuine fascination and regional pride associated with the discovery. Educational programs have been developed around Ötzi's story. Schools use him as a way to teach about archaeology, ancient history, scientific methods, and critical thinking. Students learn about the techniques used to study Ötzi, the kinds of questions scientists ask, and how evidence is interpreted to build understanding of the past. The interdisciplinary nature of Ötzi research makes him an excellent case study for education. A single discovery touches on biology, chemistry, physics, anthropology, history, archaeology, medicine, and many other fields. This demonstrates how real-world problems and questions often require bringing together knowledge from multiple disciplines, an important lesson in an age of increasing specialization. For archaeologists specifically, Ötzi has been transformative. The level of preservation and the extent of information that could be extracted from a single find have set new standards and raised new possibilities. Archaeologists working on other sites and periods have been inspired to think about what might be learned if similar preservation conditions could be found or if similar analytical techniques could be applied to other materials. The discovery has also emphasized the importance of proper excavation and conservation techniques. The damage done to Ötzi during the initial recovery, when he was chipped out of the ice with axes and jackhammers, serves as a cautionary tale. Archaeologists now recognize that finds of potential significance should be treated with utmost care from the first moment of discovery, because decisions made during recovery can affect all future research possibilities. The investigation of Ötzi's death, the forensic archaeology that revealed the evidence of violence, has also influenced how archaeologists approach ancient remains. The techniques of forensic pathology, developed primarily for investigating modern deaths, proved applicable to ancient remains as well. This cross-pollination between forensic science and archaeology has benefited both fields. Looking forward, there are certainly more discoveries to be made from Ötzi. As technology continues to advance, new types of analysis will become possible. Perhaps techniques not yet invented will extract information that we cannot currently imagine. The decision to preserve Ötzi carefully and maintain him in stable conditions ensures that future generations of researchers will have the opportunity to study him with their more advanced methods. There's also the possibility of new discoveries in the Alps or other glacial regions. Climate change is causing glacier to retreat worldwide, exposing terrain that has been ice-covered for thousands of years. As ice melts, more ancient remains are likely to be revealed. Some have already been found, though none have matched Ötzi in terms of preservation and completeness. These potential future discoveries raise both opportunities and concerns. The opportunity is that we might find more ancient human remains, ancient artifacts, or other preserved materials that could provide additional information about the past. The concern is that glacial melt is happening rapidly, and materials exposed by melting ice can deteriorate quickly if not discovered and preserved promptly. There's a race against time to find and protect these materials before they're lost. Organizations have been established to monitor glacial areas for new finds, to educate hikers and mountaineers about what to look for and how to report discoveries, and to ensure that when finds occur, they're properly documented and preserved. The Ötzi experience has provided valuable lessons about how to handle such discoveries. The broader context of Ötzi's time, the Copper Age, remains an active area of archaeological research. Ötzi has shed light on this period, but he represents just one individual from one region. Archaeologists continue to excavate Copper Age sites throughout Europe, piecing together the bigger picture of how societies were organized, how technology developed, how people lived, and how cultures changed over time. The Copper Age was a period of significant transformation. It marked the beginning of metallurgy in Europe, a technology that would eventually revolutionize tools, weapons, and many aspects of life. It saw the continuation of agricultural development, with new crops and techniques being adopted. There's evidence of increasing social complexity, with some individuals or families accumulating more wealth and status than others. Trade networks expanded during this period. Raw materials and finished goods moved across considerable distances, as evidenced by Ötzi's Tuscan copper, the flint from various sources in his arrows, and other materials from different regions. These networks connected communities and allowed for the spread of ideas, technologies, and genes. There were also signs of conflict during the Copper Age. Ötzi's violent death is one example, but there's other evidence as well. Some settlements from this period show signs of fortification, suggesting that defense against attack was a concern. Mass graves and skeletal remains with trauma indicate that violent conflict between groups occurred, though the scale and frequency are subjects of ongoing research and debate. The transition from the Copper Age to the Bronze Age would bring further changes. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, is much harder and more durable than pure copper, making it superior for tools and weapons. The development of bronze metallurgy would mark a new era, though this transition occurred several centuries after Ötzi's death. Ötzi lived during a time when the old ways of stone tools were being supplemented but not yet replaced by metal. His axe was copper, but many of his other tools were still stone or organic materials. He was part of a transitional generation, living in a world where change was happening but where the past still dominated daily life. In many ways, every generation is transitional, living between what came before and what will come after. Ötzi couldn't have known that he was living in what we would later call the Copper Age, couldn't have imagined that his body would be preserved for millennia, couldn't have foreseen that people in a distant future would study his remains and ponder his life. He lived in his present, dealing with immediate concerns, challenges, and opportunities, just as we all do. The poignancy of Ötzi's story lies partly in this ordinariness. He was probably not a king or a great warrior or a famous person in his own time. He appears to have been someone of some status, given his copper axe, but probably not the most powerful or wealthy member of his society. He was, in all likelihood, a relatively ordinary person living a relatively ordinary life for his time and place. And yet, through the accident of his preservation, he has become extraordinary. His name, such as it is known worldwide. His body has been seen by millions. His life and death have been studied more intensively than those of almost anyone else from the ancient world. He has taught us more about the Copper Age than any text or artifact could, because he is a complete package, a person with body and possessions preserved together. There's something deeply human about this story. We are fascinated by Ötzi not just because he's old or well preserved, but because we can relate to him. We can imagine his life, his experiences, his pain, and his death. We can see ourselves in him, separated by time and culture but connected by shared humanity. The questions we ask about Ötzi: who was he, where was he going, what happened to him, why was he killed? These are questions about human experience, about life and death, about violence and conflict, about survival and fate. They're the same kinds of questions we ask about people in our own time, the same narrative structures that drive stories and histories. Ötzi has become a character in a story, but he was once simply a person. This tension between Ötzi as scientific specimen, as cultural icon, as educational tool, and as a real human being who lived and died, adds depth to how we think about him and what we can learn from him. As you rest tonight, perhaps you can carry with you the image of Ötzi not as a mummy in a museum, not as a collection of scientific facts, but as a person who once walked in mountains, who felt the sun on his face and the cold wind in his hair, who knew the taste of ibex meat and ancient wheat, who experienced pain in his joints and sought treatment through mysterious tattoos, who carried a beautiful copper axe and wore grass-lined shoes, who faced danger and violence, and who ultimately died far from home in a high alpine pass. His body was covered by snow, preserved by ice, and revealed again after more than 5,000 years. In death, he has become a teacher, a window into a world so distant it seems almost like another planet, yet inhabited by people fundamentally like ourselves. The story of Ötzi the Iceman is a story about discovery, about science, about ancient times, but most of all, it's a story about humanity. It's about our capacity to learn from the past, our curiosity about where we came from, our ability to preserve and honor those who came before us, and our recognition that despite vast differences in time, culture, and technology, humans across the ages share essential experiences and qualities. Ötzi reminds us that history is not just about great events and famous people, but about countless individuals whose lives were as real and meaningful as our own. Most of those lives leave no trace, most people from the past are utterly forgotten, their names lost, their stories untold. Ötzi was one of them, someone who would have faded from memory entirely except for the extraordinary circumstances that preserved his body. Now his story is told around the world. Students learn about him in classrooms. Visitors stand before his body in Bolzano, feeling the weight of millennia. Scientists continue to study him, extracting ever more information. He has achieved an immortality he never sought, becoming famous in death in a way he almost certainly never was in life. There's a lesson in this about the unpredictability of fate, about how chance and circumstance can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. Ötzi's preservation was a matter of luck, of being in exactly the right place, dying in exactly the right circumstances, being covered by snow at exactly the right time, lying in a gully that protected his body for thousands of years, and then being exposed in 1991 when the ice retreated enough to reveal him but not so much that his body had been destroyed by exposure years earlier. Any of those factors could have been different. If he had died 100 meters away, his body might have been ground to pieces by glacial ice. If he had died in a different season, his body might have been exposed and decayed before snow covered it. If the glacier had behaved differently over the millennia, he might have been slowly crushed or scattered. If the summer of 1991 had been cooler, he would have remained buried. If the hikers had taken a different route or looked in a different direction, they might not have noticed him. Thousands of small chances and accidents aligned to preserve Ötzi and bring him back to human knowledge. This makes his story even more remarkable. He represents not just himself but all the people from the past whose stories were not preserved, whose bodies returned to the earth, whose possessions decayed, whose lives are known only through the scattered fragments that archaeology can recover. Every Copper Age community had people like Ötzi. Every village had middle-aged men who knew how to make tools, who had health problems, who traveled through mountains, who experienced conflict. None of them were preserved as Ötzi was. He stands for them all, a representative of his time, a voice from an otherwise silent age. This is the real significance of Ötzi. Not just the specific facts we can learn from his body, though those are valuable. Not just the particular details of his tools and clothes, though those are fascinating. The real significance is that he makes the past tangible and real. He transforms abstract knowledge about the Copper Age into concrete, embodied reality. He shows us that real people lived in those ancient times, people with bodies and possessions, with health and pain, with skills and knowledge, with lives that mattered to them even if they're separated from us by millennia. In our modern world of rapid change and constant innovation, it can be easy to think of the past as primitive, as lesser, as a time of ignorance and hardship that we've transcended. Ötzi shows us otherwise. He shows us sophisticated technology, carefully crafted tools, complex clothing, knowledge of materials and their properties, understanding of the environment, and medical practices aimed at treating ailments. He shows us intelligence and skill, adaptation and survival. He also shows us continuity. The human body hasn't changed much in 5,300 years. Ötzi's anatomy is the same as ours. He had the same needs: food, water, warmth, shelter, rest. He experienced the same physical realities: pain, fatigue, hunger, cold. He presumably had emotions, relationships, thoughts, and feelings similar to our own, though the content of those mental experiences would have been shaped by his culture and his time. Recognizing this continuity helps us understand that we're not fundamentally different from people of the past. We have more knowledge, better technology, more comfortable lives in many ways, but we're still human, still facing the challenges of existence, still trying to survive and thrive in a world that can be both beautiful and harsh. Ötzi's violent death reminds us that conflict and violence have been features of human societies throughout history. This is a sobering thought, but it's important to acknowledge. Understanding that violence is not new, that it has deep roots in human behavior, can inform how we think about contemporary conflicts and how we might work toward more peaceful futures. At the same time, Ötzi's equipment and clothing show cooperation and knowledge sharing. The sophisticated construction of his possessions indicates that people worked together, that skills were taught and learned, that communities supported their members. The trade networks that brought Tuscan copper to the Alps demonstrate connections between groups, exchanges of goods, and probably ideas. Human societies have always contained both cooperation and conflict, altruism and selfishness, peace and violence. Ötzi's story touches on all these aspects. He benefited from the collective knowledge of his culture, from trade and craftsmanship, yet he died violently, killed by another person or group. This duality is part of being human. We're capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty, often within the same society or even the same individual. Acknowledging this complexity is important for understanding both history and ourselves. As you drift toward sleep, let the story of Ötzi settle gently in your mind. A man from the Copper Age, preserved by ice, revealed by science, teaching us about the past and about ourselves. His body rests now in a climate-controlled chamber in Bolzano, maintained carefully for future generations to study and learn from. His story has been told here across many thousands of words, exploring every aspect we know, from his discovery to his preservation, from his health to his equipment, from his diet to his death. We've journeyed through time with him, from the moment two hikers notice something in melting ice to the ongoing scientific research that continues to extract new information from his remains. The story of Ötzi the Iceman is in some ways complete. He lived, he died, he was preserved, he was discovered, he has been studied, yet in other ways, it continues. Research goes on, new findings emerge, our understanding deepens. The full meaning of Ötzi's story won't be known for years or decades to come, as future scientists with future technologies discover things we cannot yet imagine. But the core story is here, a human being from 5,300 years ago, whose preserved body has become a bridge across time, connecting us to the deep past, showing us what life was like in an age that existed long before writing, before recorded history, before most of what we think of as civilization. In that connection, there's both humility and inspiration. Humility because we see that people long ago were not primitive or simple but had their own sophistication, their own knowledge, their own ways of living successfully in their world. Inspiration because we see the long arc of human existence, the countless generations that came before us, the continuous thread of human experience that stretches back through time. The implications of Ötzi's discovery reach into many areas of modern life and thought. For archaeology, he represents both a triumph and a challenge. The triumph is obvious, the recovery of such a well-preserved individual with so much associated material culture. The challenge lies in the fact that Ötzi sets a standard that is nearly impossible to meet with other discoveries. The level of preservation, the completeness of the assemblage, and the possibilities for analysis are unique. This uniqueness means that while Ötzi can tell us an enormous amount about one individual from the Copper Age, we must be careful about generalizing too broadly. He represents one person from one specific region at one particular moment in time. How typical was he? In what ways might he have been unusual? These questions are difficult to answer without comparable finds, and comparable finds are extremely rare. Nevertheless, Ötzi does provide a benchmark, a detailed example against which other evidence can be compared. When archaeologists excavate Copper Age sites and find fragments of tools or clothing, they can compare those artifacts with Ötzi's possessions to understand construction techniques, materials, and uses. When skeletal remains are found, they can be compared with Ötzi's physical characteristics to assess health, stature, age at death, and other factors. For the study of ancient health and disease, Ötzi has been invaluable. Medical historians and paleopathologists have learned an enormous amount from examining his preserved tissues. The evidence of arthritis, Lyme disease, atherosclerosis, parasitic infections, and dental problems provides concrete examples of health conditions in the ancient past. This information helps us understand what diseases were present in different periods, how they affected populations, and how they have evolved over time. The tattoos on Ötzi's body have influenced discussions about the history of medicine and therapeutic practices. While we cannot know for certain whether the tattoos were intended as medical treatments, their locations on areas affected by degenerative joint disease suggest a connection. If they were therapeutic, they represent an ancient understanding of the body and attempts to treat pain and illness in ways that may have resembled later practices like acupuncture. This raises fascinating questions about independent discovery and cultural transmission. Did different ancient cultures independently discover similar ideas about the body and healing? Or were there connections, transmissions of ideas across vast distances that we don't fully understand? The apparent similarity between some of Ötzi's tattoo locations and much later acupuncture points might be coincidental, or it might hint at deeper patterns in how humans across cultures have understood and tried to influence the body. For genetics and the study of human evolution, Ötzi represents a precious data point. His genome provides information about European populations before the major Bronze Age migrations that altered the genetic landscape. He carries genes that were once more common but are now rare, showing us how populations have changed. He also carries disease susceptibilities that demonstrate the genetic basis of conditions like heart disease, helping modern medicine understand the interplay of genetics and environment in health. The preservation techniques developed for maintaining Ötzi have applications beyond his specific case. Conservation scientists working on other mummies, frozen remains, and waterlogged archaeological materials have learned from the Ötzi experience. The cold storage system, the humidity control, the monitoring protocols, all of these have informed best practices for preserving fragile organic materials. Museums around the world that house mummified remains have looked to the South Tyrol Museum's example in terms of storage conditions, display methods, and conservation ethics. The balance between allowing public viewing and scientific access while maintaining long-term preservation is a challenge for any museum with organic human remains. Ötzi's case provides a model, though one that requires significant resources to implement. The story of Ötzi also raises important ethical questions that continue to be debated. At what point do human remains become archaeological specimens rather than people deserving of burial? Different cultures have different views on this question. Some believe that ancient remains should be left undisturbed or reburied according to traditional practices. Others argue that scientific study is appropriate and valuable, particularly for remains that are very ancient and from cultures that no longer exist in their original form. In Ötzi's case, there are no direct descendants or cultural communities who can claim him as an ancestor in any meaningful cultural or religious sense. The Copper Age societies he belonged to evolved, changed, were influenced by migrations and cultural shifts, and transformed over millennia into various modern cultures. No one can claim a specific cultural connection to Ötzi that would give them authority over his remains. Given this situation, most ethicists and archaeologists agree that scientific study is justified, provided it's conducted respectfully. Ötzi's display in the museum is considered acceptable because it's educational rather than sensationalistic, and because the display conditions also serve the preservation of the remains. The research conducted on Ötzi requires ethical approval and is subject to oversight to ensure that it's scientifically valuable and minimally destructive. These ethical considerations are part of ongoing discussions in archaeology about how to handle human remains. Different situations require different approaches. Recent remains, or remains from cultures that still exist and have specific beliefs about death and the body, must be treated with particular care and in consultation with descendant communities. Ancient remains like Ötzi, with no direct cultural connection to living populations, are generally considered appropriate for study, but still deserve respectful treatment. The economic dimensions of Ötzi's discovery should not be overlooked. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology has become a major cultural institution and tourist attraction. Millions of visitors have come to Bolzano to see Ötzi, and many of those visitors spend money in local hotels, restaurants, shops, and other attractions. This tourism has economic benefits for the region, providing jobs and supporting local businesses. The museum itself employs dozens of people, from scientific and conservation staff to educators, administrators, security personnel, and maintenance workers. It has become an important institution in the region's cultural and educational infrastructure. Schools bring students to see Ötzi and learn about ancient history. Academic conferences and workshops are held at or associated with the museum. The research conducted there has led to scientific publications that enhance the reputation of the region's academic institutions. Some have jokingly referred to Ötzi as South Tyrol's most famous resident, a claim that, while tongue-in-cheek, reflects the genuine significance of the discovery for regional identity and pride. The Iceman has become a symbol of the area, used in tourism marketing, featured in local media, and referenced in regional culture. There are also legal and political dimensions to Ötzi's story. The initial confusion about whether he was found in Austrian or Italian territory, and the subsequent resolution in favor of Italian sovereignty, touched on sensitive issues of national identity and border politics in a region that has historically been contested between different nations and cultures. South Tyrol, or Alto Adige as it's known in Italian, is an autonomous province with a mixed German-speaking and Italian-speaking population. The region was part of Austria-Hungary until World War I, when it was ceded to Italy. The cultural and linguistic mix gives the region a unique character but has also been a source of political tension at various times. The discovery of Ötzi, an ancient inhabitant who lived long before modern national identities, has been embraced by people from all linguistic and cultural backgrounds in the region as a unifying symbol of the area's deep history. The interdisciplinary nature of Ötzi research has fostered collaborations across institutions and borders. Scientists from many countries have worked together on various aspects of the investigation, sharing expertise and resources. This collaborative spirit reflects the best ideals of scientific research, where knowledge is pursued collectively and shared openly for the benefit of understanding. The publications resulting from Ötzi research are freely available or widely accessible, allowing scientists worldwide to build on the findings. The data, including genetic sequences and imaging scans, are often shared in databases where other researchers can access them for comparative studies. This openness has accelerated research and allowed for independent verification and reanalysis of findings. Looking to the future, there are certainly more discoveries to be made from Ötzi and from potential new finds. Climate change, while presenting many challenges and threats, is also exposing previously glaciated areas. As ice continues to retreat in alpine and other mountainous regions, more ancient materials are being revealed. Some additional human remains have been found in the Alps since Ötzi's discovery, though none have matched his level of preservation. In other parts of the world, melting ice is likewise exposing ancient artifacts and remains. In Scandinavia, the melting of ice patches has revealed arrows, tools, and other materials that had been frozen for centuries or millennia. In North America, melting glacier and ice patches have revealed artifacts from ancient indigenous cultures. In the Andes, frozen mummies have been found at high altitudes where ritual sacrifices were conducted in ancient times. Each of these discoveries adds to our understanding of the past and demonstrates the value of glacial archaeology. However, there's an urgent need to find and document these materials quickly. Unlike Ötzi, who remained frozen until his discovery, materials that are exposed by melting ice are suddenly vulnerable to deterioration from exposure to air, sun, rain, and biological activity. Organic materials can decay rapidly once exposed, meaning that potential evidence is being lost as ice melts. Various organizations and research groups have established monitoring and rapid response programs to address this challenge. They work with mountaineers, hikers, and local communities to report finds, and they maintain teams ready to quickly reach remote locations to document and recover materials before they deteriorate. This work is a race against time, trying to save as much information as possible from the melting ice before it's lost forever. The techniques and approaches developed through studying Ötzi inform these new investigations. Researchers know what to look for, how to properly recover and preserve fragile materials, and what kinds of analyses are possible. The lessons learned from Ötzi's discovery, including the mistakes made during the initial recovery, help ensure that new finds are handled more carefully. Beyond glacial archaeology, the Ötzi case has influenced forensic archaeology, the application of archaeological techniques to legal investigations. The methods used to document Ötzi's body, to reconstruct the circumstances of his death, and to interpret the evidence have parallels in modern forensic science. Forensic archaeologists working on crime scenes, mass graves, and disaster sites have learned from archaeological approaches to human remains. Similarly, the study of ancient diets through stomach contents, the analysis of ancient diseases through preserved tissues, and the use of genetic information to understand ancestry and relationships all have applications in modern forensic contexts. The cross-pollination between archaeology and forensic science has benefited both fields, improving methods and expanding the range of questions that can be addressed. Educational initiatives have extensively used Ötzi as a teaching tool. The discovery offers entry points into many subjects. In history and social studies classes, Ötzi illustrates life in the Copper Age and the transition from stone to metal technology. In science classes, he demonstrates how multiple scientific disciplines can contribute to understanding a single problem, showing students the value of interdisciplinary thinking. Biology students can learn about human anatomy, genetics, disease, and preservation through studying Ötzi. Chemistry students can explore the materials analysis, the preservation techniques, and the analytical methods used. Physics is involved in the imaging technologies like CT scans and X-rays. Geography and environmental science connect through understanding alpine ecosystems, glaciology, and climate change. Museums and educational websites have developed extensive materials for teachers, providing lesson plans, activities, and resources based on Ötzi. Students can engage with reconstructing his life, analyzing evidence, considering ethical questions about studying human remains, and thinking about what the discovery teaches us about human history and archaeology. The fascination with Ötzi among students and the general public demonstrates the power of tangible, concrete examples in education. Abstract discussions of the Copper Age are interesting, but seeing Ötzi's actual body, his real clothing and tools, makes the past immediate and real in a way that no textbook can match. This pedagogical value is one of the key justifications for displaying human remains in museums, the educational benefit that comes from direct encounter with the past. In popular culture, Ötzi has appeared in various ways. There have been video games featuring the Iceman, novels about him, children's books explaining his discovery, and countless articles and blog posts discussing his story. He has been referenced in television shows, used as an example in discussions of archaeology and history, and generally become part of the cultural consciousness in a way that few archaeological discoveries achieve. This fame has both benefits and drawbacks. The benefit is increased public interest in archaeology and ancient history. When people are excited about Ötzi, they're more likely to visit museums, support archaeological research, and value cultural heritage. The drawback is that the popularity can lead to simplification, sensationalism, or misrepresentation of the science. Some popular accounts of Ötzi have emphasized dramatic or speculative elements over the careful scientific analysis. The Curse of Ötzi story, for example, despite having no factual basis, has been repeated in various media because it makes for a good story. Scientists involved with Ötzi have generally responded to such stories with patience and humor, understanding that public interest, even when it takes fanciful forms, creates opportunities for education. The digital age has brought new dimensions to the Ötzi story. The South Tyrol Museum has developed an extensive website with information about Ötzi, virtual exhibits, and educational resources. 3D scans of Ötzi's body and artifacts are available online, allowing people worldwide to examine them in detail without traveling to Bolzano. This digital access democratizes the discovery, making it available to anyone with an internet connection. Social media has also played a role in spreading awareness of Ötzi. Images, articles, and discussions about the Iceman circulate on various platforms, introducing new audiences to the discovery. Museums, universities, and science communicators use social media to share updates about new research findings, generating public interest and engagement. Virtual and augmented reality technologies offer new possibilities for experiencing Ötzi's story. Some projects have created VR environments where users can explore reconstructions of the alpine landscape where Ötzi died, see reenactments of possible scenarios surrounding his death, or examine his artifacts in 3D space. These technologies provide immersive educational experiences that can bring the past to life in compelling ways. As we move further into the 21st century, the technologies available for studying Ötzi will continue to advance. Techniques that are cutting edge today will become routine, and entirely new approaches that we haven't yet imagined will become possible. The decision to preserve Ötzi carefully ensures that future generations of researchers will have opportunities to study him with their advanced methods, potentially discovering information that we cannot currently access. There may come a time when the Ötzi research has extracted all possible information from the remains, when every analysis that can be done has been completed. But that time seems distant. After more than 3 decades of intensive study, researchers are still making new discoveries, still finding new questions to ask, still developing new techniques to apply. The body and artifacts hold layers of information that we are gradually peeling back, each layer revealing new insights. Ötzi lived his life without knowing he would be remembered. And now, as this journey through Ötzi's story comes to its conclusion, we reach the end that is also a beginning. The end of this particular telling, but the beginning perhaps of your own reflections on what it means to be human, to be connected to the past, to be part of the long chain of existence that stretches from the distant past through the present and into the future. If you found this journey into the past helpful for your rest, if you enjoyed learning about Ötzi and the Copper Age, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment below. Your support helps these videos reach others who might find comfort and fascination in stories from history and science. But more importantly, rest well. Let the images and ideas settle into your subconscious. Let the story of Ötzi, of a person from the ancient past whose life touched ours across millennia, accompany you into sleep. Dream perhaps of mountain passes and ancient forests, of copper axes and grass-lined shoes, of a time long ago when the world was young and people lived lives as real and vivid as our own. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you're part of the same human story that Ötzi was part of, separated by time but connected by the simple fact of shared humanity. The mountains still stand where he walked. The stars still shine as they did when he looked up at the night sky. The wind still blows through alpine passes. And somewhere in Bolzano, carefully preserved and maintained, Ötzi rests in his cold chamber, still teaching, still connecting, still showing us who we were and, in many ways, who we still are. Good night, and thank you for joining this journey into the past. May your sleep be peaceful, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder of human history and the connections that bind us across the vast expanses of time. Rest well, and remember that every person who has ever lived was once as alive, as real, and as human as you are now. Ötzi reminds us of this truth, preserved as he is across more than 5,000 years, still teaching, still connecting, still human. Sleep well,